I know, shocking, right? Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of Fake Accents Unite. We must be coming up to episode 100 at this point. I do need to go back through the archive and check.
You must have passed it at this point.
Check basically where we are. Sorry about this. I just had the stream open on the side and was drowned momentarily by my own voice. I'm joined this evening.
I know the feeling.
I'm joined this evening, as always, by the Britisher. Good evening, sir.
Good evening, Sutscoen. Where art thou? Eat your heart out.
This is a reference which will make sense in a minute, no doubt. We're also joined by regular guests, Froggy and Rose of Dawn, who join us from across the YouTube sphere. Thank you guys for coming on.
It's all right. Happy to
Hello.
be on.
Sorry. Hello. Nice to be back.
Hello.
And finally, we are all in the shadow of a self-described establishment Tory this evening, a former Oxford tutor linked to many universities, a writer for The Spectator, The Wall Street Journal, for Quillette and more, and writer of several novels. It's Helen Dale. Thank you very much for joining me.
Hello.
Yes, we're all considerably out-educated for this particular stream, but we appreciate you coming down with the plebeians for this one.
Oh dear God! I'm going to get this is very
Well, you know, that's definitely a build-up, isn't it?
Is someone's going to send this link to Fraser Nelson and he'll watch it and then he'll just roll around the office laughing.
Dear, we have had a few people who've come in and several people who've renewed their membership or who have joined. So thank you very much to those who have. Coney Current Year starts us off and says, "I have a question for Helen. As a journalist with a blue verified checkmark on Twitter." The ultimate slap in the face, obviously. Do you think that blue checkmark journos deserve the hatred that they receive?
Well, I don't get much of it. I've got my own approach to running my Twitter account, and my policy is just people who are rude to me or rude to people who I have mutual follows with. I just mute them. I've never had to block a lot, but I have had a conversation about this with Christopher Snowdon at the Institute for Economic Affairs, who's also a blue check mark, and he has to block a lot. But the thing is, he's employed by a think tank and they pay a salary. And because the IEA has to be so careful about disclosing its sources of funders, because what happens is they get home visits from nutters.
Right.
That's what happens. I mean, this is a standard thing in think tank world. Excuse me, I've just had supper. And so he has to block them, because otherwise all they do is get in these mentions and go, who funds you? Who funds you?
That's like what they do at Christian Niemitz.
Yeah.
Oh, well, Christian Niemitz has made a huge joke out of it.
Who floods you?
Because a lot of it, they're so bad at typing, or they do it too quickly. They don't say who funds you, they say who fnuds you. And so he calls it fnuddery. And so he has fnuddery. And the thing is, that's a couple of right-wing journalists, one of whom's a blue check mark, who, because of his employer, is forced to do that. And I'm sure lots of lefties think they're both grubs for doing it. And the thing is, I see, yes, the blue check marks are dominated by people on the left, because Twitter is a left-wing platform. It's quite in the same way YouTube is centre-right. It just is. And they get a version of the same thing, constant abuse, versions of fnuddery, to use Christian Niemitz's line. And I see this happen to them, and to ones I have mutual follows with, like Chris Snowdon and Christian. And that would get very old very quickly. I mean, I would get very sick of it myself. And I have generally avoided that kind of thing. But I wrote one piece, and some of you may be aware of it, for The Spectator last year on Greta Thunberg, where I made a joke about she was being used as a human shield by the environment movement. The title of the article is Operation Human Shield. And there was a short version ran on Coffee House, and then they ran a longer version in the print magazine. And they were using her because she was underage and autistic. And the thing is, that's why she only ever got softball questions and everything was made very, very easy for her. And I made a joke in the article that if they actually put her to the test and stuck her in front of Andrew Neil, you'd have to wait till she was 18, of course, but yeah, she'd finish up doing the Watusi on the carpet in Broadcasting House. Because, I mean, Andrew Neil's an attack dog, but a very clever one. He's not aggressive like Paxo. He's avuncular and he sucks you in. And a lot of conservative Americans have seen what he did to Ben Shapiro. There was very little of Ben Shapiro left at the end of that. He really did get.
I mean, was there very much of him to begin with? Is that?
But yes, he really did get burnt to the ground. And I mean, we can talk about later on why that happened, because I think that there's a broader socio-cultural phenomenon going on there with members of minorities never really being pushed in the way someone like I am. If I go on Newsnight, I mean, I've been interviewed by Emily Macklis on Newsnight, and she did not give me any quarter because Tories are not supposed to get any quarter. And so I stood my ground. I know how to stand my ground because I've always had to fight. Conservatives always have to fight.
We're tempered in the kiln, yes.
Yeah, that kind of thing. And so I would get very annoyed with that if someone did it to me all the time. People don't do it to me all the time because they can't hang me on an employer. I mean, I write for lots of outlets, lots and lots and lots of them. And someone's booming. Boom, boom, boom.
I don't think that was me.
And so that is where some of the arrogance and the bad behaviour from your blue check marks comes from, is people constantly doing this. And I only had it once with that Greta Thunberg piece where it was retweeted like 5,000 times and I had 5,000 replies, and they weren't all just having a go at me because lots of people agreed with me as well. They were having enormous fights in my mentions, and Twitter just became unusable. I just had to turn it off. I wasn't on there for a week afterwards. And the thing is, here's me. At the time, I think I might have had 15,000 followers maybe. So very much a mid-sized account for a blue tick.
Yeah.
Imagine if you've got 150,000 followers. I was trending on Twitter, #1 in the UK for 2 days. You know, this is not an experience I wish to repeat again.
You see, I have one post that goes semi-viral. I feel much the same way. Yes, and I'm nowhere even close to that. Good grief.
Well, I think with the blue check marks, it's also that kind of the stereotype out there is that the blue check marks also will, how shall we say, they will tick just about every single woke talking point that you possibly can. I mean, I think it's fair to say that the overwhelming majority of blue check marks on Twitter are of that ilk. You know, I mean, you were saying about conservatives. I don't think there are that many conservative blue check marks out there.
Well, we're certainly outnumbered. I think that's fair, but I would need to do a statistical analysis, and I've never bothered. But we're certainly outnumbered, that's for sure.
I think they exist, but also...
And I admit mine are my little sort of specky crew. There's me and Fraser Nelson and Stephen Daisley and Christopher Snowden and that kind of thing.
Kate Andrews. There's some kind of background noise once in a while coming up from someone.
Yeah, I could hear that.
Likely to be myself, isn't it? Why not?
Is it traffic? I can hear like cars and stuff.
Yeah, it sounds almost like traffic on the outside or something.
I was worried it was me, but it's quite quiet outside for a change.
I will. Yes, my microphone is. Okay, I'm gonna shut the window. We'll see that's going on. In the meantime, assuming my mic isn't doing terrible things, I will also say, Coney currently says Minneapolis might accidentally create the Muck Police, which is coming up. So this is obviously the news that in America, in Minneapolis, they are looking at, or certainly entertaining the notion of abolishing the police in favor of a community-run initiative.
Which they haven't actually clarified what that means yet.
Not at all.
I tried to find out, and it just seems to be all of this, like, yeah, just, oh, well, we will just replace it with community, and everyone will be empowered, and everyone can, you know, chip in. But this is all vague, because they can't get rid of an entire police force and then just replace it with nothing. There has to be something behind it.
I think they themselves at present don't quite know what they want to replace it with.
And then when you ask them, they get very angry, I've seen. Like, you dare go and try and pick up the bizarre kind of thing which they're pushing. And I find it actually terrifying that this is not very quickly, in the space of a week, become almost a mainstream demand. Because this is generally the kind of people who you would see pushing for the complete demobilization of the police is the far left. It generally seems to come a lot from the same kind of socialist circles that push for prison abolition and replace everything with, you know, kind of community like rehabilitation.
Well, if I pull up the Black Lives Matter official website, because I assume that this is what they're taking their lead from, given that they're the people who are threatening a lot of change. Where's this now? Sorry, just forgive me here. I wasn't
While you're looking, it was funny because you mentioned it being the Mac Police, you know, as in sort of sponsored by McDonald's, no doubt. I think in that case, it might be more appropriate to suggest the police being sponsored by something like Charmin or Andrex.
Just what, softer, kind of gentler politics? Is that what it is?
Well, yes, but also consider what those products tend to be used for. And indeed, Helen, it includes puppies. Yes.
There are puppies. There must be puppies.
One that I noticed with this is that D. Ray McKesson, if that's how you say his name, who was one of the original Black Lives Matter guys, the guy that used to wear like a sleeveless bomber jacket type thing, whatever you call it, like a vest that's a coat. And that was his calling card. He came out with something like hashtag 8 can't wait, which was like a list of sensible police reforms, which has kind of been criticised from the right, saying we already do this. But it also got criticised by Black Lives Matter for not going far enough. And to be fair, they were relatively sensible, but they were also things that had already been done.
Yeah. The United States has serious policing problems. I mean, and it's quite false if you go and do a statistical analysis to just say that it's all directed at black people.
Yes.
I don't, however, apart from relatively limited changes, like one that the Cato Institute, libertarian think tank in Washington, D.C., has always recommended, is ending qualified immunity for police, you know, so that they can be charged when they do a bad thing in the course of their duty, the same way. I mean, over here, you can be charged. Yeah, this is a mad American thing. It's just, I mean, those who saw me on trigonometry would have said I called the United States a failed state, because that tends to be how Australians look at it. We just sort of go, oh my God, they can't do anything. They can't run anything. They're just hopeless. The people, you know, the fact that so many Americans become successful is a credit to them as individuals and nothing to do with their country. It's just a basket case. It's like, might as well be Somalia.
I'm trying to remember which country it was where it's basically in a similar way. I think it's Italy, actually, where they have you're unimpeachable. Oh, no, it's Brazil. I'm thinking of Brazil. So when Bolsonaro came in, because he was being sued by several people, but when you go into a political office, you become unimpeachable. Effectively, you can't be sued.
It's a Roman law thing. You have immunity from prosecution while you're in office, but you lose it once you leave.
But of course, it's the worst thing because in terms of corruption as well, because people promote their own family members who are also in the dirty work and their colleagues, because they know it's effectively a get out of jail free card. When it comes to the American policing system, I mean, I think it's very, very clear that there is a huge accountability issue in the police. We know that Derek Chauvin was this is his 18th offense. We don't know what the other 17 are, as far as I can tell. I haven't been able to find any further details on those, but we know it is his 18th offense. And I think that the lowest number of offenses that his colleagues had, I think that Officer Tao, I think his name is, had 8 offenses, or 7 or 8, and so like that's the minimum that they've got there. So there's clearly an issue, and to play devil's advocate on the whole kind of anti-abolition of the police thing, I worry that the abolition of their police and starting over will be the right decision, being made for the wrong reasons and with the wrong people in charge of building up a new police force effectively, especially when I found it now, Black Lives Matter, in terms of their policy demands. So they are asking for various things, including what they call decarceration. So especially for black prisoners, reparations for slavery, that sort of thing. But community
reparations for slavery is just an outlandishly silly
yes.
idea.
Yeah.
I mean, I shall quote my father here, God rest him. I've never owned slaves, and you've never picked cotton. Now bugger off.
Yeah.
A lot of people seem to misunderstand the reparations arguments. Anyway, one of the things that I've seen over the last couple of days about the protests in the UK is this claim that the UK has been paying reparations to slave owners and stuff, and all the way up to 2015.
2015.
And but that's not quite the case, because what they're doing is they're just paying off the loan which was needed to pay off people in order to release slaves.
Well, it's like Lend-Lease.
Bond
issues like this, or gilts, they are actually spelled G-I-L-T. It's a gilt.
Yes.
Are a very, very common way to deal with large amounts of long-term debt. I mean, it took until Thatcher for Lend-Lease with the United States to be paid back for the Second World War. And there is quite a serious case to be made that the Americans behave very badly in those circumstances, because we're supposed to be allies, and you're not supposed to do that to your allies. This is why there's sort of all of this World War II history that people are bringing up, like the Bengal famine with Churchill and that kind of thing, is actually a lot more messy and complicated than
just starving a people for fun.
Well,
it's all very messy, and like Lend-Lease is messy, and it was the amount of money that with the abolition of first the slave trade was 1807, and then the abolition of slavery full stop was 1833. Although the earlier decisions, Shepherd and Wedderburn and Somerset's case. Shepherd and Wedderburn was the Scottish case, and Somerset's case was the English case.
I'm also, just on that point, I'm infuriated because people have been talking about the abolition of slavery and the Britain's prominent role in it, and lots of people in the comments screaming Haiti 1804. 1804, is it? Was it 1604?
No,
regardless,
1804.
Yes, and then but they completely ignore the fact that even their rhetoric is wrong if they're talking about single nations, because the Philippines abolished it something like 125 years before that. But it's not to do with a nation abolishing individual slavery. The British abolished the slave trade, which is something completely different. Sorry, go on, Helen. Sorry.
And just the point about the 20 million quid in 1807, which is a vast sum of huge amount.
Something like 19 billion by today's money.
This is why it took until 2015 to honour the gilts. Is a decision was made in the United Kingdom to compensate slaveholders for their property loss rather than going to war.
Yes, because it was a civil war thing.
This is what people don't. They've got this idea in their head that, you paid off all the slave owners, you rotten stink. Well, Abraham Lincoln didn't pay off the slave owners with the Emancipation Proclamation. Do you know how many Americans the Civil War killed?
many. I don't know the number.
600,000 in battle and approximately 200,000 subsequently due to terrible injuries or to starvation or to being mistreated in prison
Related
or
issues,
camps,
yes.
Related issues. But the headline figure is 600,000. To give you context, that is more dead Americans than all the other wars that the United States has ever been involved in ever, added up together.
Yes, it was the quickest, dirtiest way that we could have solved the problem, but it did solve the problem.
Without lots of dead bodies.
Yeah.
You know,
Yes.
Yeah,
I mean, a
I mean,
lot of
also,
these leftists just love the idea of piles of dead bodies, and they need to be reminded of it more.
It's
the
also
other thing, I guess, about the American Civil War is they basically went back to zero after it, as far as I can tell. I've definitely heard lots of stats quoted that basically they had to rebuild the country again. Now, I don't know if that was in terms of debt. They were basically at zero in terms of capital they held versus the debt that they were in. But
everything was a mess. The country was
leveled
burnt to the ground.
yeah.
Yes. I mean, there's a very, very good TV series called The Civil War, and it's done by Ken Burns. And it just goes, and it does the battlefield tour thing, which you tend to, the reenactors are into, and this kind of thing. But it does it very well and with a lot of sympathy and thought. It came out a number of years ago, probably 20 years ago now. And you just get period pictures where people were just starting to take photographs with those big, heaviest plates to take photographs with. You needed that special silver ionizing stuff to take pictures. And everything is just devastated. You know, and the thing that it reminded me of when I first encountered it, and I'm not an expert in American history, and I very, very seldom write about it for this reason. I spend lots more time writing about Britain and explaining it to the Americans, or writing about Australia and explaining it to the Brits, and I only very occasionally in the other direction. The other thing is the battlefields that it reminded me of are all the terrible pictures that you get, that we are all very familiar with, from the First World War. And I mean, one very little telling detail from that Ken Burns documentary is when you see the pictures of the Civil War soldiers lying on the battlefields, you notice their uniforms are all sort of messed up and ripped apart and so on and so forth. And when you see pictures of the Somme or Ypres or whatever, you get the same thing. And the reason for that is because the soldier had gone down, had been hit, and he was desperately tearing his uniform off to see if he'd been gut shot.
and
that is why their uniforms looked like that. Because if you'd been gut shot, you were going to die. Because in the Civil War, they were using dum-dum bullets. The British might need to explain to people what a dum-dum bullet does. I can do it, but it would be better if it comes from a military person.
You think the British was military?
I am about the least military person you could possibly think of.
And I was involved with things.
You're good on military history, though. So.
One would hope. I was involved mainly with planes in the sky, so it's not really my area of expertise. But go ahead, Britisher, for your historical context.
Well, as far as I understand, the dum-dum bullet, I think it's fair to say it's a modern name, but it kind of spreads out as it hits, thereby, increasing by far the amount of damage it will do to the tissue into which it tears, rather than going in as a nice round little ball, if you know what I mean.
It's not through and through, as they would say.
No, it goes like this.
It's basically shrapnel.
And spreads. The lead spreads through the body. It's incredibly destructive.
It's really bad. In fact, it's interesting because given that our small caliber arms from nowadays can do similar damage to that, if only because we've just got so good at making little 9mm rounds that often, if they don't actually go through the entire body, they bounce around inside you and they can come out anywhere. And in much the same effect, a bit of a mincing effect. But yes, yes, you don't want to get gut shot by anything really at this point.
Yes, I remember one. It was some kind of documentary. I think it was on the BBC, in which they were kind of showing. I think it was former police officers or whatever go to schools and confront youths in troubled areas with various photographs or x-rays of injuries from gunshot wounds, in order to try and discourage them to get into gang culture and things like that. And just as you said, when the bullet hits, it can kind of bounce around in your body. And there was one particular x-ray in which the bullet had ended up in this unfortunate chap's scrotum.
Oh.
So it had kind of bounced around the body and then eventually ended up down there. Yes.
All the gentlemen currently watching this or listening to it have all just crossed their legs.
You can't see it, but I've somehow managed to cross my testicles. Just jumping back a second to the chat, we were talking about the abolition of the police. So the Black Lives Matter thing, we were saying they are advocating for community control of the police. And this is described as empowering residents in communities of color to hire and fire police officers and issue subpoenas, decide disciplinary consequences, and exercise control over city funding of police.
That's not going to be abused at all, is it?
In its entirety. What
could possibly go
Jesus
wrong?
fucking Christ.
Apartheid Part 2.
The thing I am most reminded of, really, is the loony left in Britain. Wasn't it Hackney and Lambeth Council or whatever in London? They were kind of completely off the rails and needed effectively to be reined in by central government.
Until Diane Abbott, the great prowler of course, North, came in. Yes.
But no, I remember there was some absolute lunacy coming from that part of the world. And I think they too didn't like the police. Now, they weren't in a position to defund it or get rid of it or whatever. But I remember hearing that they took various steps to make the police's life more difficult. Because I guess that's what counted for populism in that particular part of the world at the time.
You do get this, because in my youth, I used to be young and silly and take libertarian ideas more seriously than I do now. And they...
Sorry, I know many libertarians, and that's just fun.
Thanks.
And anyway, they would, on the weird end, they would shade into anarchism. And anarchism really is a political philosophy for little children.
Yeah.
Who don't think. And there's a wonderful passage in Steven Pinker's Better Angels of Our Nature where he describes when he was a university student in Toronto, and Bakunin was his lodestar at the time, and he got into this anarchism. And anyway, the police in Toronto had gone on strike, and within a day you had like buildings burning down and 40 banks robbed and cars on fire and people, because Canadians are like Americans, they've got very high rates of firearm ownership, and Canadians in their houses basically sitting there waiting for the and in the end it became a disaster. It was just a complete mess. And there's a very good detailed description of it. It was in the 60s, and basically the Mounties had to be, the kind of federal body, had to be sent in to restore order. It was just a disaster. And Pinker says very sort of one sentence little summary at the end of this 3 or 4 pages. If you've got to the end of it and your hair's standing on end, going, my politics left when the Mounties arrived. It's just sort of, it's just, it really, but there is sort of a bit of empirical evidence with what happens with societies where they don't have a police force, but they are higher than Dunbar's number, which is 146. And societies do quite rapidly build up some sort of authority, police authority, but it becomes very punitive. It becomes very localized. It embeds extremely conservative norms because it's the only way that people can be safe. And you also finish up in some societies, particularly monotheistic societies, you get the problem of men policing men and women policing women.
Yes, so you end up with the moral core for women,
Yes.
mainly. Yes.
And it's very, very distressing and really, really, and there's some quite well documented studies and records of when this kind of thing has happened from medieval period, also from medieval Japan during China during the Warring States period, this kind of thing. It's
even
really,
locally,
really destructive. Yes.
Even locally here around the First World War, that kind of sort of thing happened in British towns when we had or were they the White Flower Girls? I can't remember the white. They used to basically conscientious objectors to the war.
White feathers.
White feathers.
Yes, white feathers. That was right.
Cowards.
Yes. And they used to give them it because they, you're a coward. That was that the kind of moral judgment there coming in from the women's corps. And it's interesting as well how many historical novels, especially from Eastern Europe, that I've read, where they talk about how there is the men's council and the women's circle, and these two factions effectively interact to keep the town on base or whatever it is. Yes.
But yeah, and it's also why you very, very seldom get in societies that don't have governments that we recognise. I mean, like there's lots of records of this with the Australian Aborigines. You find it's so rare to get communities any larger than Dunbar's number. And when, for example, there was a pitched battle fought between a core of fairly powerful Aboriginal tribe and Whitey, basically near Mount Isa, and the tribe in that area was called the Kalkadoon. And they managed to mass 7,000 warriors. And there's since, and it's one of the few times that the Aborigines managed to give Whitey a bloody nose, because they didn't have a government the way the Maori in New Zealand regularly got the Brits and went
and slapped them about a bit.
They could unite the entire island, the entire of the North Island and the entire of the South Island, and they all spoke the same language, and they had government and exceptionally good military training, and they were big and strong, and the difference was so great that it typically, I mean, you had British complaining that a male Maori warrior was worth 3 redcoats and a female Maori warrior was still worth 2, because they were biologically so much bigger, because they had so much protein in their diet. So the Aborigines were very different from the Maori. And anyway, the Kalkadoon managed to mass 7,000 warriors, and there's since been some historical research into how they managed to do that. Incredibly difficult in that kind of society, because they just didn't have all of the norms about governance and chains of command and authority and so on and so on. Because 7,000, that's half a division. That's a lot of guys.
Are you effectively saying, if you don't have those norms, there's a bigger chance of the 7,000 destroying themselves rather than the enemy?
Yes, basically, that's the problem with it. They can't manage themselves. They become incapable of managing themselves.
I'm terribly sorry, Helen. Is it possible to turn your microphone up a little bit?
I don't quite know probably don't know how to do this, but does that sound better? I'm just literally just twiddling knobs on the thing.
It sounded better when you got closer just then.
Oh, right, okay.
The closer you are to the microphone, the louder it is.
Does this mean I have to sit here like this?
Oh, no. It's all right. Just a little bit.
I'll try.
Marvellous. Thank you, Helen. Yes, going. Yes, back to this community control thing. It's like you need to. I kind of compare it when you're kind of thinking about how the British police changed over time towards more modern policing. Not that we can say everything about modern policing has been a raring and roaring success, but certainly a change towards a more scientific than a gut feel approach, and some interesting things to do with standardization of practices. Although I would argue that obviously because we used to have a lot of local constabularies with differing protocols, that it's gone a bit too far in the other direction now. It's a bit too centralized. The rotation means that often people are not familiar with their local officers and that sort of thing, and it makes things difficult. But I can certainly see how they had to drain the swamp effectively, because there was a lot of localized corruption, which is again why part of the rotational system came around.
Rotational systems are ancient. The Romans used to do it, and they did it for exactly the same reason. So you would have troops sent to an area who were not of the same ethnic or linguistic background as the the people that they were because
policing.
this is the whole French thing of the gendarmerie, the military police. That goes back to Roman times. It's a different tradition, but they encountered that as well, and that's why you had Mauritanians on Hadrian's Wall, because you couldn't put Celts there because they'd all start picking fights with other local Celts.
Yes, the
horror, the
interfactional stuff.
Glasgow Rangers and Celtic is a thing for 2,000 years, this kind of business.
Yes, it is somewhat worrying to think of Mauritanians and Syrian archers on Hadrian's Wall without central heating.
Well, I think the baths were heated, but so they were warm twice a day when they had a wash.
Yes, but that's twice a day. You can't help but sort of feel sorry for them. That was a certain amount of cruelty, if you know what I mean. I think later they brought in some Dutch folk. I think they would be.
You do get letters from Vindolana along the line of sometimes from Italians.
Send warm underwear. Yes.
Yeah, send warm underwear, or send it. Dear Mum, we've conquered Britain. Why? and then sort of 3 weeks later, there's a letter. Dear Mum, my girlfriend has red hair and she's really hot. Cheers, Marcus. To the Romans, to be ginger was to be the best looking. That was the most.
Then again, it's
how times have changed.
It's worth remembering, of course, that those were the letters that were never sent. Hence, we've got them. Yes.
So a point I would make about I've sort of been musing on it, but the American police, they don't. The Americans don't really seem to believe in good government at all. So the idea of good government, and not that, I mean, I'm quite libertarian, so there's plenty of arguments against the idea. But the Republicans don't seem to want to do it well, or don't think it should be there at all. Largely, I mean, obviously they do, and the Democrats seem to want, rather than evidence-based policing or like you say, science or good practices that are sort of cascaded down from the top, they seem to want democratic government. So they seem to think, well, if we can just run it locally and have people vote on everything, then that will work out well. But clearly that doesn't work either. So the kind of the left-wing idea of good government is, well, if we just have everybody involved and voting on everything, it'll work, which is what they seem to be suggesting with this abolish the police, right? From the things that you were reading out.
It's a very Summerhill school approach, direct democratize everything. Although in this case, it seems to be certainly tied into the progressive stack.
Yeah.
So they don't want to hand direct control of the police to everyone in the Democrat-run city. They want to hand control specifically for local ethnic communities on the basis of race, which is why, and I imagine white people will be excluded from that.
They would
but as a whole, I think it's a huge issue to, because you've got the monopoly on force, which is given to the police in Western democracies. But so the expectation is that if people are unhappy with the way the police are doing their job, they elect councillors who will put in place police reforms and that sort of thing. As we know, it's very unlikely that reforms ever are what they say on the tin. They're not usually reforms when they go through government, and this is kind of coming to a head here anyway. But I think a lot of it is less about the letter of the law and more about the attitude of both the community and the police in general. At the moment, there is zero trust between either group in America, and they don't know what to do about
Froggy actually, he's made a good point here where he talks about people in America, and he's right. It's commoner on the right than it is on the left, although a lot of the left have it too, where they appear not to want the government to work. And the view, when I was working in Canberra for an Australian politician, Australia is one of these extraordinarily well-run countries, and New Zealand is the same. New Zealand's just beaten coronavirus completely. Australia will be, in a couple of weeks, Australia will be in the same place. And the only reason it's behind New Zealand is because it's got a big city like Sydney and it's more connected to global markets. But both Australia and New Zealand, and to a lesser extent Canada, but only slightly less, have what is known amongst political scientists as very high state capacity, which is the bits of stuff that the government does. It does extremely well, and there is a social expectation that government should be competent and accountable at the same time. And Tyler Cowen, an American economist, has christened his version of this state capacity libertarianism. And he thinks that libertarians have to give up this idea of getting rid of government or making it bad, because that means people will vote against it. They won't. All they'll try to do is get control of the levers of power and then shake it down, like the Democrats are, which was what Froggy was referring to, and Rose was talking about, and just line their own pockets and help their own mates out, so it becomes corrupt. Now, there's just no history of that in Australia and New Zealand. It hasn't been for probably 100 years. Certainly at the federal level in Australia, there was problems in my home state of Queensland with corrupt police, and the way that they were reformed was when I was at last year of high school and first year of university, was really quite impressive. But they don't believe that they can build state capacity, and that they also, and this is what gets back to Froggy's point, they don't believe they ought to. They don't believe they're obliged to, for whatever reason, whether they're right wing or left wing. And that is why the United States gives that appearance when you go there of being a failed state, and just being terribly badly run, and nothing works properly, and so on and so forth. And whereas then you go to a Westminster country like Britain, and it's obviously much better run. But then if you are familiar with the Westminster system and you go from Britain to, say, Australia or Canada, you notice that Britain isn't very well run compared to those Commonwealth countries, which really have put a huge amount of emphasis over decades in terms of government policy, of making sure that whatever it is the government does, it has to be delivered competently.
Jumping off from that, I think, just as a side note, I've definitely seen criticism of how we dealt with the financial crisis compared to, say, Canada, where we just said, well, we'll just cut everything, I don't know, 10%, 20% across the board, because we need to cut government funding. Whereas somewhere like Canada would have said, well, we used to run this particular sector and now we're not going to. So we're handing this back to the private sector.
Austerity was a very bad policy. I mean, you don't like to channel Jeremy Corbyn, and a lot of the things that he said were silly and just wrong and nonsense. But austerity was a very bad policy.
Yes, people like it to the fact that everyone was fed up of Gordon Brown, obviously,
and
at that point.
He just threw money around.
He threw money around, and he destroyed a lot of the liquid assets of the country, especially with the debacle involving the gold. But it, of course, aside from any other social stuff, with the fact that I can't remember what it was, something like a woman had written to him and he'd written something back and misread it because of his lazy eye or something. He's very poor. Anyway, when everything like that went away, and we got in this policy of austerity because people realized that something needed to be done, and this seemed about drastic enough to kind of bring us back on side. But didn't really, I mean, David Cameron, as much of his call me Dave rhetoric, we're all in this together, big society thing, just it wasn't very well realized, aside from it being a poor policy in the first place.
So I just want to understand a bit more about what Froggy said in regards to Canada. So when the Great Recession hits, the UK goes along with austerity, right? And so what they're doing is they're just cutting down on all the things which the government is responsible for. Am I reading it right that Canada's response was, rather than just kind of cutting things across the board, they'll just outright get rid of things that they can kind of lose and just put that into the private market, but still keep the institutions which they can run well fully funded?
Yeah,
did I understand that?
That's the impression that I got. Yeah.
I'll just note here that Froggy's talking about Canada, but Australia didn't have any knock-on from the global financial crisis. The Australian economy has only just entered into recession now, and only 0.3% negative growth for the last quarter, and that's the first time there has been a single quarter of negative growth since 1991. You really are, when you're looking at Australia and New Zealand, you are probably looking at the two highest state capacity countries in the world.
Mm.
In the sense, in the Tyler Cowen sense of these places are extremely well run.
Right.
Now, you might be able to point to places that are close to that, Switzerland, Singapore, and until a couple of years ago, Hong Kong. But there are characteristics of Singapore and Switzerland in particular that most people in an Anglosphere country would find very discomforting. Homosexuality is still illegal in Singapore, for example. It's very socially conservative.
They ruled on it last year, didn't they? That they said it would be unconstitutional to make it illegal. Yeah,
I think a lot of that also has to do with Malaysia being so close by and with it being quite a hardline Islamist country.
And also Switzerland doesn't have that problem, but Switzerland's got the cantonal system, and it has that thing that you find in small communities where they police themselves, are very, very strong informal norms. So if you go outside of them, even if something isn't against the law, there's so much social stigma attached to it that you're in quite a lot of strife. And that is why there was a canton in Switzerland that didn't give women the vote until I think 1991.
Good grief.
Because they were really, and Switzerland as a country at the federal level only gave women the vote in 1971.
Well, I think when it comes to countries like Switzerland and Singapore and the Luxembourgs and Liechtensteins and whatever, I think one also has to accept that there's a certain amount of exceptionalism that can be attributed to small countries who can kind of, how shall we say, they can use sort of rules which otherwise sort of fall between the cracks. They can set themselves up as tax havens and things like that. I mean, the Swiss banking system, for example. Whereas
British Virgin Islands,
for large countries, that isn't really a practical solution. So I think some of those small countries, yes, they as you said, British Virgin Islands, they seem to be these kind of little exceptions, and they are kind of using exceptions that they work for them, but you couldn't really come up with a model like that would work for the United States of America or Germany.
They're hard to scale up, basically. It's very, very tricky to get right. But yeah, so the point about people in America not actually wanting to do government properly, or they only want to do it for their mates, is real. And it's why they have.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I've sort of been in discussions with people where, you know, when it comes down to any kind of detail, they suddenly kind of withdraw and say, well, I wouldn't want the government to do that anyway. And that's when you indeed kind of realize that that is perhaps one of the drawbacks of, you know, if people aren't even interested in having it well run, because a large section is just that doctrinal about not wanting it there in the first place, so that invariably you are going to end up with it being badly run, because there are simply not sufficient numbers of people who actually care about it being done properly.
And all the recruits won't be either. You know, they were not going to come in with the same expectations. You know, it's one of the reasons why the armed forces has such a, some people call it a chip on their shoulder, but they have this thing about we expect excellence. When I attested into the Air Force, they sit you down and they say, you know, you've come up, you've beaten 3,000 other applicants in order to get to this position. It's been a 12-month process. We expect excellence from you, but you're fully capable of it because our methods are so pristine, etc. You know, how much of that is propagandistic in this kind of age? And there are certainly many issues with the military that I noticed while I was in there. But the general gist of things of, like, there's an expectation. You are sold an idea as much as you are selling yourself for a job. And so there's this idea, you know, that there's something which a lot of other police forces fail to ever get, is that idea that people aspire to something, you know, beyond themselves in terms of that. Whereas for many, it's seen as either a power grab or it's good money, and that's about it. And when it becomes about the money, which sadly it becomes for various people joining the military, I find, then that's where the failures happen, because those people are not on board with the same kind of ethos. But yes, anyway, sorry, just my tangent there.
Yeah, are you saying that Saddam Hussein's press secretary was correct when he was always referring to the Western mercenaries who were coming here?
Certainly not. Sorry, Helen, go on.
Just got a mental image of that guy with his hands up. Nothing to see here. Nothing to see here.
Oh, yes.
Jokes.
Don't worry, you are perfectly safe.
Yes, and things are blowing up behind him. Everywhere, rockets are going off. But yeah,
Leslie Nielsen is a treasure. Yes.
Yeah, just before I came on the show, I did a tweet thread, and I don't know how many of you saw it. I mean, because I've changed my mind on something, and I do this quite a lot compared to most people. As in, I recycle my ideas quite regularly.
Mm-hmm.
But I always used to be concerned when people wanted to defund the BBC. And that account is now following me on Twitter. People wanted to, and I think it's blown up very quickly because of the terrible reporting over the weekend.
Oh yes, we'll get onto that in a bit.
Wanted to destroy the universities and all of this kind of thing. I have come to the view, it's classical liberals always have the view that you don't create institutions of power so that you can get what you want, because the danger is you'll lose the election and then the other lot gets them. But I actually think you can't let the BBC and the universities and the civil service, and Cummings is going through the civil service like a dose of salts, and I think it will eventually be sorted out. But the BBC and the universities are not. And I used to my Tory friends in Australia, the LNP, the Liberal National Coalition, used to go, look, we just have got to get the universities by the throat, halve their number, sack half the staff. You don't need half of them. They teach rubbish. And you finish up with all these unemployable, useless ning-nongs who run through the streets of Sydney and break windows. And I mean, they didn't do, to be fair, the Black Lives Matter protests in Australia were largely commandeered by the country's Aboriginal community, and they generally behaved very responsibly because they've got their own issue that's nothing to do with America, and it's black deaths in custody. And that's it's fortunate that the Australian protests then finish up focusing on a genuine issue. I mean, my last homicide matter that I dealt with in Australia was a black death in custody policeman who'd allegedly knee dropped and then killed an Aborigine in the watch house on Palm Island. And it was a very complex and messy and unpleasant case. And let's just say it was my last case. I left criminal practice. I came to the UK. I changed the kind of law I did. I finished up being a corporate lawyer and then a government solicitor and then back to being a corporate lawyer again. And I swore, I remember sitting on the flight because I'd won a scholarship to Oxford. I remember sitting on the flight. I had a business class ticket. It was lovely because someone else paid for it. And I remember sitting on the flight and going, I never want to be in a criminal trial again as long as my backside points downwards. It was really unpleasant. But I'm just looking at the...
and then you flew away from Australia to the other side of the world, so technically it's facing the other way. I don't know. Yeah.
It's just... Yeah, good joke. But I just don't think we can continue to have people thinking that it's somehow legitimate to win arguments by chucking statues you don't like in the canal or defacing Winston Churchill.
What happened?
Sorry, and anybody who thinks that that's a way to win an argument, and that's they need to be condemned the way Priti Patel did today in Parliament. Yeah. But not only that, all the people coming out in sympathy with them in senior major institutions like the BBC and like some of our universities. Oh, really? I'm going to cut your funding off. I never used to think that, but I've now come to the view that I think what Scott Morrison is doing in Australia, he denied the universities access to the JobKeeper program, which is the Australian equivalent of the furlough scheme over here. Okay. Basically, the universities are falling like nine pins in Australia. They're all running out of money, and we're going to lose all the crappy woke universities. But in the course of the next couple of years, the number of universities in the country will probably halve. I just think that's starting to happen here because
it sort of is. The difficulty with the universities here, aside from the fact that because the issue here is not necessarily the universities as institutions, although there's certainly issues, as much as it is our student union network, which is almost 100% run by the National Union of Students,
who are grossly corrupt in themselves.
Who have a huge issue themselves. They are. We thought that we had possibly seen the end of them because they're massively in debt at the moment. So they're raising all their fees for the other unions because in order to be associated with the NUS, they have to pay some stupid amount of money.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the idea that most students are that bothered about the 5% off that they get with their NUS card, but it was considered something of a prestige, and obviously having access to resources. Now those resources have all but disappeared because of the debt which the NUS is in, and more than ever before at the university near where I live, I've noticed that there has been a kind of not a reckoning, but certainly more ideas floated about becoming an independent student union and the success stories of other independent student unions.
When I was at Oxford, you would periodically get JCRs and MCRs disaffiliating from the NUS because they thought it was a giant waste of money and they would rather spend the students' money in the college. But I mean, Australia dealt with that by making student unionism voluntary.
Yes, which is not here.
They broke the back of the student unions that way. But we still had, the thing is, Australia with universities, despite dealing with that problem, still had all the horrible, woke, silly crap. And it's only stopping now because the government's saying, no, we're not going to give you any more money. And as I said in one of my tweets... As I said in one of my tweets, I'm kind of annoyed with my side of the political aisle, and this is very much an argument with Tories. It's not an argument with Libertarians. It's not an argument with the sort of the centre left or anybody else. It's a mistake that the Conservative Party has made. Instead of fighting the battle of ideas with all of this silly nonsense, we've waited for coronavirus to come along and do it for us. And that's kind of gutless.
Yes.
And there was a very good article in The Critic today by Ben Sixsmith that makes exactly that point. You know, we've not fought this.
The issue,
not stood our ground.
The biggest issue as well is the way in which universities are funded at the moment through the student loan system, which is basically if the university can put on the course, the government will fund it for whatever student goes in, and they can charge the full amount, as opposed to having, even a tiered system based on what the economy needs or is expected to need.
There's actually a very simple fix to that.
Mm-hmm.
What you do is you make each individual university responsible. So you take away the centralised body, the student loans company, and you make each individual university responsible for collecting the fees and being the debt collector. So you silo each institution. And now what that does, it produces a phenomenon known as statistical discrimination, which is basically courses that people study when they then go out into the workforce. That if they don't go out into the workforce, then the university makes no money. So those courses finish up being axed gradually. It takes about 5 years for this to work. And then the next step that you also do, the other thing that the virtue of statistical discrimination is basically we've got a problem at the moment where too many women go to university and not enough men.
Yeah.
And also the courses that they study isn't very helpful. They're kind of crap in the sense that a lot of very smart women who should be doing STEM don't go and do STEM. And so you get all these complaints from feminists about not enough women are doing STEM, even though STEM or law or finance or the prestige professions obviously earn more money. Now, the reason for that is because basically a woman can go and study feminist dance therapy or whatever and get no penalty for doing so.
I mean, you don't even have to pick out like a ludicrous degree. I mean, you only have to look at where the vast majority of people go in. So, for instance, my own discipline is psychology, where the class sizes are massively inflated because a lot of people have many preconceptions about psychology, but there's only so much room for psychologists in society, and
also an awful lot of psychology is basically Sude's Corner as well.
Oh yes, we can talk about that another time, I'm sure.
Sude's Corner. And then the other thing that happens, because women leave the workforce for having when they have children, and they don't tend to earn as much for that reason, it's an earnings penalty, a child penalty. You are not going to go to university and study feminist dance therapy if you're a woman and you won't ever be able to pay for it, and the university is going to be sending debt collectors around to your house. So the smart girls will go into STEM or finance or whatever, and the ones who are too thick will just go off and find a bloke and get married and reproduce and stop annoying everybody else. It's just really
well, the hope is that it would stop a lot of family pressure, and also just kind of wanderers. I would call them. Yeah, I can afford to, but I call them wanderers because then
have kids if you do STEM. It doesn't matter, but you can't afford to have a child if you do feminist dance therapy.
But there's a lot of people. There's a lot of people I know who are at university, not necessarily just because their parents did, but they're like, I don't really know what to do with my life. None of the careers in my local area grab me, and so this is. It's not. They won't ever describe it as a deferral of reality, but they will describe it as a. It's a time to find myself, etc., etc., etc. And if that's suddenly costing them, then it become, in terms of opportunity cost, as the economists would say, it's not viable anymore. Then it
might
becomes
start looking for themselves somewhere else.
Yes.
I remember when I went to uni in 2007, I actually studied international politics for a semester. And then at the time I thought, like, why am I bothering wasting my time going into university? I'm not exactly going to get a job in politics.
No.
I ended up leaving, but the local economy back where I grew up was kind of rubbish. Like, there wasn't any kind of real jobs to go into. And so I felt compelled to go back into university, this time doing an IT degree. And honestly, that was one of the worst decisions of my life. I would have much rather have not had the pressure of being, right, you either get a job now in one of these like kind of basic roles or you go to university. There's very little time between sixth form and being into the world where I could actually sit back and think, what is it I want to do? And in fact, I've only really been having that conversation with myself over the last year. Right now, I'm deciding whether I'm going to become a journalist or whether I'm going to go to cookery school. But like, that's the kind of conversation I should have been having when I was about 17 or 18. But that never happened. Instead, what's happening is people being pressured into going to these places. And because they don't really know what they want to do, they go into these courses which sound attractive. It sounds fun. It sounds cool and trendy, but it's useless. What you end up doing is wasting 3 years of your life getting
finishing up in debt.
But it's not even whether or not they're trendy or not. People look at it and they say, oh, that looks good, and then they realize university is actually bloody hard work. So if you want to do anything, so again,
media studies is a bad one. Like, I remember a group of friends did media studies in uni. And one of their I think it was like one of their coursework or exam or something, their research book was just a picture book.
Oof.
Some university courses are complete crap. They just need to be defunded.
Yeah.
The ones that Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay and Peter Boghossian hoaxed, the ones they call them grievance studies, it's all just nonsense. I actually read through some of the stuff that I'm scholarly, and I read it through, and the thing is, there is less information in there than there is if you go to the Creation Science Museum in Kentucky.
You can always you can identify these disciplines as well, because there's not a lot of sort of interdisciplinary citation, so they won't even cite their own work, so the interest stuff, and they won't cite from other disciplines. So even you can tell the disciplines which aren't, for lack of a better term, cucked in psychology, because they will draw from things like medical journals and psychiatry and various other bits. Now, there are plenty of flaws within all of those disciplines and with psychology as a whole, but you can tell the people who've actually put their back in to try and marry this up with other forms of reality and other perspectives from other disciplines.
Yes, whereas one of the things I found when I did because I had covered the Helen Pluckrose story for the Australian, and I did a big feature, big 2,500 word feature for the weekend edition of the newspaper, and those to do them properly. And I did an interview with her and all of that kind of, to do those kind of things properly takes a lot of time and quite a lot of research and so on and so forth. And I also had some theory subjects inflicted on me as an undergraduate, forcing the classicists to do some theory subjects. And my overriding memory of them was that they were just nonsense. And if you wanted to write something halfway that would get you a good mark, you just took a big bong hit first. And then wrote the paper. Whereas you couldn't get away with that in Latin. If you tried that in Latin, you go into the exam and get a Tacitus with all these ablative absolutes in an unseen and write complete shit.
When it comes to these various university subjects, I'm pretty much with Sargon on this one, because I don't know if any of you remember this, that some time ago he proposed that we don't care how you do it, but get rid of these social justice subjects. That they should just be cold.
I used to disagree with him, and today that's when I put my Twitter thread out.
Because the thing I would put to people is, with all this trouble we've just had, with all these riots, how much of that do we actually think was organized on university campuses by the very people who run those subjects?
Yeah, certainly the likes of the NUS would have had a hand in it. If you look through the various different motions that the liberation campaigns, as they call them, liberation in itself is quite a radical phrase to use for people who already have all the rights that they need. But they will regularly put in motions about funding anti-fascism work and no hate speech on campus. And you look into any of them, like for example, like the LGBT campaign, the trans campaign, because for some reason they have to have two. When you look at the kind of people who are getting the leadership positions within these liberation campaigns, they will often jump between the campaigns themselves. Like an interesting one is the relation between the likes of the trans and the LGBT campaign, because it seems to be a whole group of friends who will just kind of swap positions. And the only reason one of them went last year was because this person was caught to have masturbated whilst at work. At which point the NHS completely shut down any kind of talk on it.
Oh, who was that? That was
Jess Bradley.
Jess Bradley,
but,
yeah.
There is
being reported, yes.
But it's a serious issue because the NUS completely hid it. I chased the NUS on it. I pursued them for months. Only really, the last answer I got was that it's now a police matter, so they can't talk any further.
Because they kept her on, didn't they? She was suspended, but she was on retainer, so she was still being paid.
She was on. Yeah, basically.
And the point is, these people are being paid with our money.
Yes.
And I'm just sorry. I'm just not willing to wear that anymore. And I'm just going to say this. I sound like the most dreadful Tory here. I know. This is where the establishment Tory comes out. My willingness to fund nonsense has just ended. And and the fact that coronavirus is just cutting its way through the universities and is probably going to Stephen Davies, he's a historian, and he made the point. He said, I strongly suspect a large amount of nonsense will simply stop. But he said it won't stop because it's been defeated, unfortunately. It will stop because it has no money.
Do you know, I think it's also to do with the universities in general get the vast majority of their funding from overseas students.
Yeah.
So I think it's not. Yes. So
them.
it's the overseas students who are going to be far less willing to send their child abroad to study whatever nonsense subject it is, as opposed to something like STEM in the future, and that's what's going to drain them. I do just want to. I want a final word on this, but I want to bring us back to the Black Lives Matter thing, and then we'll
There is one last thing which I want to add about the NUS and the kind of the connection with these protests. When I'm able to.
Oh no!
Go.
Sorry about that. Okay, so when you look at the kind of the people who are actually active within these, despite claiming that they represent, like 1.5 million people, the actual elections only attract a very small number of students. Like some of the positions that they have might not even get like 1 or 2 votes, which will be the person running for the position and their friend. But
the way they manage to do that, by the way, is not by making, because they do run large campaigns across the campus, especially with people who are there to try and get them on. But what they do is they have so many positions and so many candidates that people don't want to engage with it. And also, oftentimes, the candidates are all saying the same rhetoric, so there's no diversity of choice anyway. So
well, they don't do. Plus, they also don't do anything. I remember looking over a kind of like end of year thing for the trans campaign, and none of them lifted a finger. But going back to it, despite only engaging with a very limited amount of people throughout, they still have a elevated position, and so it looks like these are people of authority when really they're not. But because universities now have become a hotbed for like quite radical activism, they're certainly much worse state than they were when I was in uni 10 years ago. Like these radicals are getting put into positions which with barely anyone looking, and they have access to a lot of vulnerable and impressionable people, and they are able to encourage them to engage with absolutely ludicrous political views. Like prison abolition is a big one in the NUS for some reason. Like, a lot of them support prison abolition. It has nothing to do with the cause that they're apparently trying to liberate, but they still do it. So you're getting these radical views put in.
Well, it's kind of,
it does have influence, even if very few people are voting for it.
Indeed.
I'll just warn you that my sound quality is likely to have dropped off a bit because I've had to unplug the Rode, which is a proper
microphone,
and you're now getting my crappy iPad sound, and the reason for that was because my battery had got down to 10%, so I've had to plug the thing back in. So I'm sorry if the sound is not very good now, but the alternative was me just completely disappearing. So
I think we're fine with that. We can certainly hear you.
Yesterday had my mouse playing all sorts of shenanigans, and it took me a while to work out that it was because it's a wireless one. It was actually the battery in it that had gone. So I wished I had a warning, as you do on your Rode microphone.
Well, no, the Rode is fine. It's a USB microphone. It's the iPad battery, and the thing is, because the Rode is meant to be for a proper my big desktop.
Yeah,
my desktop doesn't have a camera. I use my iPad, so I've bought the little connector, this little device, which I shall pick up here, which allows me to plug the Rode, the proper radio microphone, into the iPad, and it makes me sound like I'm being interviewed by Dimbles or something. But the problem with it is it's a proper microphone, and
it draws a lot more energy,
and it draws a lot of power. And I came in with my iPad fully charged at 100%, and it's now at 10%. So let's just say the Rode did very well, but now it's over.
All right. So when it comes to, I'm sure we'll all have noted, I mean, the title of this stream is largely peaceful edition.
This is why I brought up the business about the BBC.
Indeed.
Because I'm just furious. And the thing is, I'm the type of traditional Tory who, as long as we had the proms and Radio 4, then I was reasonably happy with continuing to pay the licence fee. And after that, feeling like I was an extra in 1984.
Yes, I know, right?
Sort of like Winston Smith.
Very strange. I believe that the last big protest which had violence at it was the Free Tommy Robinson protest in the area, and that protest was characterized by the violence happened. 5 people were injured, and it was seemingly because Antifa descended upon the crowd and started smacking people left and right. But the way that was reported was, like violence breaks out at far right rally to free Tommy Robinson, etc. Whereas this one, they have issued not a retraction, but they've changed the title of the article. So it's gone from 27 officers injured at largely peaceful protest to London anti-racism protests leave 27 officers hurt. This has been this figure has. Yes, and this figure has actually been updated today.
49 now.
So yes, it's just under 50. So that's it's not a small number of people. I cannot remember the last time that so many officers were there, and I'm sure all of us have seen the footage of the poor, very ill-equipped little. I don't know if they're specials or if they're full officers running away from the crowd who are pelting them with objects. And there just seems to be, I wonder, not just how, because they've got the officers who are injured, so that's presumably officers who are treated, and then there's just officers who had to deal with just people lobbing things at them throughout the entire day. Especially the ones who refuse to take a knee.
And also using the well, I mean, the thing is, because Cressida Dick told them not to, so most of them weren't trying to take a knee. But I actually think using the Tommy Robinson comparison is not quite so useful. And this is part of my general thing of taking on Black Lives Matter and taking on this rhetoric that there is racism in Britain. I actually think minorities and activists need to be kicked a lot harder when they make this claim, because statistically it's nonsense.
Yes. And there's been no pushback on it at all, apart from the old media.
I mean, honestly, the appropriate response is, once again, what Priti Patel did today, where she spun it round on them and said, I will not be lectured by people, and then went through with all the dreadful racism she's had, but from lefties.
Yes.
And I mean, I was sitting there going, Priti Patel for Prime Minister.
On that point, sorry to interrupt, just before you continue, did you see the reaction from those MPs on Twitter, where they were really, really angry with the fact that Patel pointed out all the instances of racism she's encountered? Like they said, "Oh, this is a really low blow," and I'm like, "Is this not?
This is your entire rhetoric.
This is your rhetoric. This is how you guys gain social currency." But like they just, but obviously, Patel is a bootlicker because she doesn't have the same views as them, and because minorities, like Biden said, if you don't vote for Biden, you're not black. And
it's like Peter Thiel isn't gay.
Yeah,
I mean, Jermaine Greer isn't a feminist.
Yes.
It's Douglas Murray, and that sort of thing.
Hashtag no true.
Yeah. Kanye West isn't black. I mean, I've had a little bit of the Helen Dale isn't gay thing. I mean, I'm not a feminist, so that's not one you can throw at me. But I've had a little bit of the Helen Dale isn't gay. And I mean, there have been times when I have been tempted to put my Twitter profile, conservative homosexual, deal with it.
Yeah.
It's just, and I'm not alone, and there's quite a few of us.
The irony there is that you're not actually telling the Conservatives that they have to deal with it in that.
This is the world that we're in now. This is
but no, you absolutely. This is the thing with the Patel has done the right thing, because this rhetoric of this idea. This is why I don't want to use Tommy Robinson. If you're going to get stood on by the police in this country, it is very occasionally, and not recently at all, because you're black. Yes. Overwhelmingly, though, it is because you are white, working class, and a football fan. And the most egregious example of appalling policing in this country was Hillsborough.
Yes.
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 And this is, and there are times when I want to get black people having a moan and grab them by the throat and go, whack, 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 stop whinging, you whiny, snivelling professional victim. You wouldn't know. I mean, Afua Hirsch, for example, grew up in Wimbledon and went to Oxford.
Yes, the woman for those of you who don't know, sorry, just to educate the audience, Afua Hirsch is a professional activist who once said that I want white people in Britain to become a forgotten nation or a forgotten people. That is her entire career.
The idea that Afua Hirsch has ever experienced anything more difficult in her life than period pain is fatuous nonsense. This is what I mean about hacking to the minorities. So don't do it by like that. Do it the way Andrew Neil did to Ben Shapiro. And I mean, I know Ben Shapiro is a Tory or conservative in the American tradition, but I mean, one of the reasons why I can be very, very fair on this, because I sometimes get people say to me, I bet you wouldn't say that about a Jewish person. And they don't know that the first big controversy of my career was over this book. And the people who were having a go at me,
because of your heritage, wasn't it?
Yeah, but the people who having a go at me were overwhelmingly Jewish. And I'm quite happy. And this is one where, I mean, once again, I'm not carrying any brief for him because I think he's a dreadful person. But I'm happy to use Jeremy Corbyn's phrase of the Jewish lobby, because they do what every other trans lobby, black lobby, the Muslim Council of Britain, they all do the same thing. They all have the same playbook. They can't argue for toffee. They accuse you of racism or homophobia or whatever their group is, or anti-Semitism, in order to shut you up.
Yeah.
And they all do it. Every single group does exactly the same thing. Now, that doesn't mean that the anti-Semitism that has emerged in Labour isn't real. But one of the reasons why Jeremy Corbyn did so well in 2017, and we have internal polling in the Conservative Party, we know why this is. One of the reasons he did so well in 2017 is because nobody believed the Jewish lobby. Because all they do, to use an Australian expression, is go off like a frog in a sock and accuse everybody of being racists. And then they don't prove it. And so
what you're saying is it's Froggy's fault.
One of the things that I did noticed when I had the controversy over the hand that signed the paper in Australia was how bad the people were at arguing with me.
Yeah.
Yes.
But they were dreadful. All of these Jews, they were just dreadful. They couldn't argue for toffee. You know, I remember getting into a row with one bloke, and he was going, "You can't say that Israel shouldn't exist. That's anti-Semitic." And I'm going, "Well, Australia's Aborigines on every Australia Day call it an Invasion Day and say that the country shouldn't exist. Are you saying that they're racist for saying that Australia shouldn't exist, or are you saying, or are you allowed to make that point, but then are they allowed to make that point and you're not, or are you allowed to make that point and they're not, and why is there a difference?" And I just got word salad basically, and
a lot of ad hom, I imagine.
Oh, it's dreadful. I was called for everything. So what I realised, and I finished up, I formed, you know how that chap in America, Lee Jasim's done all this research on stereotypes, and the stereotype of Jews is smart, financial, good at maths, good at arguing. And there's a particular tradition of exegesis in Judaism, which actually has historically made Jews exceptionally good at arguing compared to other people. And I first read some of this after my controversy. And I remember sitting there thinking, Lee Jasim, you're full of shit. Because every single Jew I've met can't argue for toffee. And I finished up meeting a very dear friend of mine now who is Jewish, who could argue in that traditional Jewish way. She'd come from a Hasidic family. And it was extraordinary to encounter her. I mean, I got painted into a corner a few times, and I just sort of sat there and thought, and until one day I asked her, I said, "Why can you do that?" And all these idiots I was fighting with on the 7:30 report, which is the Aussie equivalent of Newsnight, couldn't argue for toffee, and I finished up making them go bright red and sputter, and all they would do was call me racist or anti-Semitic or so on and so forth. And she just looked at me and put her head on one side. "Oh, well, if you can just call someone a racist or an anti-Semite, then you don't have to learn to argue, do you?"
No,
and then
it's basically
if someone doesn't accept the label and then just continues to argue, like when I was making the Invasion Day point that the Aborigines use, then they're lost because they've never been put under pressure.
Well, they've realized, I mean, all these different special interest groups have realized that much in the same thing is that, the human psyche works off of symbols, and the language is the symbology of, how we communicate. And if you can control the language, you control the people. And so this is why everything is couched in a moralizing thing. It's why every attack that comes in is a shame. A shame thing. It's interestingly, I think, something that they've taken traditionally from the right, because the right is, whereas the soft left has been more about encouraging people universally, whereas the right, I think, would say, has more traditionally been about selectively encouraging people, which is again why as you grow older you become more right-wing, because you have more to lose and you stop thinking about following your dreams, which is the encouragement of everything, and more about what you're going to settle into, which is a selective encouragement. But my point is that they've taken this moralizing language, which would usually be used to attack people who deviated from the norms in local communities, and applied it on international issues, or even just national issues, or what they consider to be issues, and they've weaponized their identity rather than their arguments in that sense.
And it came home to roost, because what happened was my friend in Australia, my Jewish friend in Australia, and I watched it together. Because I sent her the link to Andrew Neil, Slice Dicing, and Julienning Ben Shapiro.
Yeah.
And her response was, "He is that Jew who has forgotten how to be a Jew and how to argue. And he encountered someone who would not give him any ground on that basis. and he had no defense.
Mm.
And it is her theory. And she just said, this is happening to every minority now. The old joke used to be that if you're a woman or a black or whatever, you have to be twice as good to get half as far. She said, now you've got the problem of you only need to be half as good to get twice as far. And so you get all these people like Afua Hirsch, like David Lammy, like Ben Shapiro. They're all, and mainly lefties. Occasionally you get it on the right. And Shapiro's an American example, who can't argue for toffee. And they just come across as thick. And so then you get this awful stereotype then that every minority, Jew, trans, gay, black, is stupid. They're feeding this awful stereotype. But then the other dreadful lesson I learnt out of this is the reason conservatives argue so well is an accident of history, is because we're totally outnumbered in elite institutions. And so to pull off what Priti Patel did today is purely because Priti Patel has had a lifetime of practice at doing that. If you put a lefty under pressure like that, they go to water. They're done because they've just completely, the argument muscle has atrophied, and that is that means
it used to. I used to see a lot more of the balance of it back when traditional television programming used to. Sorry about that. Used to provide sort of more long form content, which I feel like is something which is now being taken over by the podcasts of the world. You see it with things like to a degree with trigonometry, and to a lesser extent. But I'm waiting for the point at which, because Joe Rogan is the biggest podcast in the world at the moment, right? He's just signed his £100 million exclusivity deal with Spotify.
I'll be interested to see how that goes.
Yes, me too.
Very interested.
But he often talks to one person at a time, and the debate sphere of things has largely stayed off the podcast circuit. It's just generally been the host asking questions, and it's very interview format. But the debate sector, which is, I feel, largely developed on YouTube, has become effectively a screaming match, because the things that do well on YouTube with regards to debate have been the worst of the worst. They call it internet blood sports. In fact, there was a stream series about that. But there needs to be a point at which these discussions can be had between what you might call learned thinkers on both sides of the equation. And obviously the audience is always going to claim that one side gets destroyed or the other. But I don't know how to do it, but I don't know how it's going to be incentivized, because the ones which bring in the revenue are the ones which are the most the internet blood sports one. Yes. Kill Stream it was called. Yes.
I mean, I've seen stuff from like monk debates that have been all right, but they're generally
they can M-U-N-K. They're Canadian.
Yes.
Okay.
Private institutions, I feel, outside of YouTube, because at the moment YouTube's monopoly is bizarre, because the audience is mildly right wing and obviously children, and the the management is very, very progressive. So private institutions need to come up, and then these things need to be hosted on various sites. Especially, I feel like new social media, which is more and more geared toward, like, this is the reason YouTube's still around, because new social media is geared more and more and more towards low attention span. I mean, the last two big breakout social media companies were Snapchat and Instagram, both of which have sort of and TikTok as well, all of which have kind of a 5 to 10 second threshold for any content which goes up on it. So there just needs, but I feel like there is a demand for it if it comes out, because of course, someone like Jordan Peterson, his lecture series, when that came to prominence, garnered very long, and I mean, his biblical series is is many parts, and they're all about 5 hours each, so it's it's ridiculous.
Yeah, personally, I prefer the long form YouTube videos. I love being able to put something on which is like half an hour, 40 minutes, and just kind of sit there and chill.
Well, the interesting thing is that just tying back into the educational thing, people who come out of universities and have graduate positions are the ones who tend to be on the forefront of the new social technology, as well as as well as children, obviously, who have a lower attention span anyway. But the people who are really benefiting from the longer form content are people in professions, particularly like this podcast here, this stream that we do now. It's about 1.5 to 2 hours long usually, and the vast majority of the audience are people who put it on for a drive, people who put it on at work whilst they're doing something else and they're listening along, or people who, you know, it's their detox in the evening. And so there is a market there, but it's in a particular sphere of professions, I tend to find. Anyway, not sure where I was going.
But the other thing that is there's an implication to this, though, because we're so tribal and because we like comfort food and the kill string and all of that kind of thing. The advantage that conservatives have in debate, and the advantage that someone like Priti Patel has when she's race baited by the likes of Lanny or whatnot, is an accident. And it's an accident that only exists because we constantly have to be, one of you used the expression, you know, forged in a fire, but it wouldn't otherwise exist except for that accident. And my argument against myself when I'm saying no, the Tories have to use their big majority in a way that they've never done before. We've always thought this wasn't cricket to do this. You don't do this once you've got the levers of power because the other side will try it on and so on and so forth. The argument against this is if we decriminalise the licence fee, I think everyone can live with it. You can't have single mums going to jail because they don't pay for the BBC. That's just ridiculous.
Yes.
But I mean, that's obviously ridiculous. It was for a while there, it was the main reason for female criminalisation in these islands. But other stuff like this Twitter account, which is now, and the organisation behind it, it's obviously an institution that you can tell that there's an institutional backing there as well. Defund the BBC is if we defang the institutions and coronavirus defangs that's going to happen to the universities anyway, is this weird temporary advantage that conservatives actually have at the moment, in that if you get into an argument with one of us, we'll win, will go away simply because the institutions that we've constantly had to swim upstream against will have been killed off either by the pandemic or because the great British public just gets sick of the BBC sticking someone up with a pride flag in front of the proms.
But it may come back again in some ways, in the sense of international competition, because the institutions in Britain, the predominant narrative that I get from everyone that I've ever been to university with who's from abroad, and everyone I know, is that the English institutions appear to be trading on a reputation that they no longer uphold. This is something which is recognized by the international community when they come over, basically. So you've got all these professionals who are going, well, I spent a lot of money on my English education, but really what I got there was nothing, was perhaps not as good as what I get my more locally and cheaper. But we've basically bought the name, the name on the paper. That was the thing.
This has also happened in Australia. People have complained that, how we have the Russell Group here in Australia, they have the Group of 8, which are like the equivalent of the Russell Group or the Ivies. Although none of the Group of 8 are as good as the very best Russell Group. It's still, I have to admit, I mean, I had always effortlessly eaten everybody else for breakfast in Australia academically. And then I went to Oxford and I still ate everybody else for breakfast. But my God, I worked 16-hour days to do it. Because suddenly I was in the middle of all of these people who were just as clever as me. And it was a shock to the system, my first term at Brasenose. It really was. I was sort of like, oh, okay, you can't just walk into the exam and wing it. You can't, if you have to write a paper on something you think's a bit boring, you can't take a bong hit beforehand and write it. It's not going to work. You're going to get it back. I remember getting a paper back with 55 on it, which was the worst mark I'd ever got for anything since starting school at the age of 6. And it was just, oh my goodness, smart. And I remember sort of sort yourself out, catch yourself on, grow up a bit, Helen. I had to have that conversation with myself. So there's but that was law, of course. I came here and did a law degree, and I went to I went to Brasenose, which is a very, very strong law college. There used to be this joke that the superior appellate courts in the United Kingdom weren't just Oxford, they were Brasenose, because so many people went to this one Oxford college.
The Eton of lawyers.
Of lawyers. So maybe I got some special benefit for it because I went to Brasenose, I don't know. But I did get a very strong sense of a step up. But I have heard exactly what Not So Obvious is saying from a lot of people, including from Chinese friends, who feel that they come to the University of Queensland or the University of Sydney or whatever, and all they're doing is paying for the name, and they haven't got anything better than they could have got in Beijing or Shanghai or whatever. Yeah, and they're quite annoyed, and I think they have a right to be annoyed because their parents paid a lot of money, and they're from a Confucian culture that prizes education.
Well, when it comes to the BBC, I mean, given that we started on this about the BBC coverage of the, they very much are trading on a reputation they really no longer deserve.
As well,
because, I mean, we are talking, what was it, Kenneth Clarke's Civilization, we're talking Jacob Bronowski's Ascent of Man. I mean, where are any even attempts
Planet, I remember
making anything
Tom
like
Baker,
that?
Doctor Who when I was a kid, the Goodies,
Then
Dave Allen.
the Dimblebees, the Dimblebees who've pretty much had a career in media. Are you aware of the fact it was actually their dad who made the name?
Yes.
Because he landed with the troops in Normandy and broadcast on the radio from the beach of Normandy.
He also, Dimblebee's Relief of Belsen.
Yeah. So
And
you've basically got kind of cutting edge where the BBC really was sort of the gold standard globally. And now you look at it, and precisely that, 27 police officers hurt in largely peaceful protest. And you look at that and you just go, I'm sorry, but if you go back 50 years, you would have been hauled before some editor in the BBC and asked what the hell you think you're doing if you would have produced a headline like that.
And also probably spanked afterwards by the weirdo who did the sculptures on Broadcasting House.
Oh, good grief, yes. They're so disturbing if you look at them.
Yeah, but also he was an actual kiddie fiddler. A very talented artist, but I can't remember.
That explains the number of large men standing over small children on the statues in Broadcasting House.
Mind you, when it comes to statuary in the BBC, the ultimate irony, of course, is that they unveiled that statue to George Orwell.
Yes, with the statement above it as well, which was ridiculous. It's ridiculous how far they've fallen given that. And so I've just got two stories to kind of go through before the end, and we'll do super chats towards the end. Yeah. I know there's a few there who are interested in your opinion on some things. Helen and Britisher. So Uber Eats, which is one of these delivery companies like Just Eat or Deliveroo. I think it's primarily in the capital and the cities, but they have offered free delivery from restaurants owned and run by black people, as in they are not going to charge it's going to be offering discounted rides to black businesses. So if you're a black business,
legal?
I don't believe so.
Is it not?
I'm not sure.
It's not. I don't think it's legal.
But so it will be waiving delivery.
It's also shutting the gate after the horses bolted, because it should have been reasonably obvious from the video footage that to the extent that criminality was happening, there was violence from both blacks and whites.
Yes.
Looting was being done by blacks, and destruction was being done by whites.
Yeah.
And it was overwhelmingly in minority neighborhoods. So the places that were being destroyed by middle-class
minority-run, businesses.
By middle-class white people who, to re-up my Afua Hirsch joke that you all finished up laughing at so much, the boys have never had anything worse in their lives than jock itch, and the girls have never had anything worse in their life than period pain. And so they were the ones destroying things, and poor black people were stealing things. And the people whose livelihoods were being destroyed were overwhelmingly minorities. You could see that. You could see
Yes.
there was the occasional white restaurateur, but overwhelmingly they looked like black people.
The funny thing you've overlooked with this is not happening in America. This is happening exclusively here. This is in the UK that they are.
I thought Uber Eats was doing this in the US and Canada.
I thought it was. Yes.
I see. Sorry, and my
No,
apologies.
my
It is
understanding,
New
it is
York.
the US and Canada. You can't do it here. If you tried to do that
Yes,
here,
that was right.
You would have. Oh,
sorry, I misread it because it.
There would be Equality and Human Rights Commission.
Yeah.
Because Labour tried this same thing. They tried to. I think they had one rally where they charged. I think it was people of colour, quote unquote, less than white people, and I think the Equality and Human Rights Commission got involved in that. So.
There was a similar thing in, I think it was in Paris, where I think there was a group of kind of like black activists who wanted to do like a feminism event or something, but it was only for like white women weren't allowed to go in, and then that wasn't allowed to operate for that reason. So it seems to be. If this is going on and it's going on in the US and Canada, it's actually really concerning that they allow selective like kind of discrimination like that. I mean, these people who are celebrating.
You would think it would be contrary to the Civil Rights Act.
You would think so.
The problem I've got, I'm analysing it like a lawyer. And I'm qualified in English and Scots and Australian law, which these are all places where I've practiced and have the right sort of background. I mean, I can understand American legal rulings. I can read a judgment written by the SCOTUS and understand the law and that kind of thing. But I have no training there and I'm not qualified to practice there. I don't have a practicing certificate. And there are things about American law that even as a lawyer trained very well at the highest standard in a common law system, I just sit there and I look at it and I find it completely baffling. And I just have to sit there and go, Helen, don't say anything because it's 747s, as my dad used to say, 747s over my head.
What I find strange with this, though, is they might be celebrating that Uber Eats is able to enact like positive discrimination in favor of, the group of the moment, as it were. But therefore, the same logic should surely allow that kind of positive discrimination to then also benefit other races. What if you had a company that wanted it to do benefits for white people?
This was Barry Goldwater's.
It's very libertarian, isn't it?
It's an extreme form of libertarianism that I actually disagree with. I do think that quite a lot of the race relations legislation and the positive discrimination legislation should be done away with. There shouldn't be preferences to help black people get into American universities because we now know it's at the expense of Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans and Indian Americans. That's enormously well documented now. There's piles of information about that. Basically, poor bloody Japanese Americans, they're the ones really up against it. They basically have to be 5 times as good as everybody else in order to have a chance to get into university. It's just appalling.
You say the Japanese Americans, but largely it's I think they discriminate basically if someone's Asian. And
they all cop it terribly. Yes, they all do.
But as I understand it, at least the Japanese are, stereotypically, I guess, smart. But if you're a Korean, or maybe not a Korean, but someone like a Mongol or something. Well, no, but I
sorry, it's just like if someone like at least the Japanese are smart. If you're someone like a Korean,
it's
stupid Korean.
When it comes average educational standards, yes. If you've got groups which are perhaps on the lower end of the, there's a blanket expectation on people from the Far East, which does not apply across all.
They're all clever clogses,
which does not apply across all national boundaries, especially in poorer areas.
Yeah. So if you're from like a less intelligent, on average, or
and you still need to,
or you're a China. I mean, I think there's certain Chinese immigrants from certain areas that have a certain culture that are smart, whereas others that don't.
Right.
So to just discriminate blanketly across that person is Asian, so they will be smart. Well, they might have actually been someone that came from. I'm struggling to think of small, poor Asian countries.
Hmong. That's a good example. The Hmong, who are the Vietnamese hill people. They were the ethnic group in the Gran Torino film that Clint Eastwood directed and acted in. the ethnic minority in that, and they are very poor, and that's why he showed in that film social problems in their community, because they come from a very, very poor part of the country, and the only reason they finished up in the United States was because they might have been very poor, and the communists in Vietnam hated them because they thought that they would automatically be communists because they were poor people, but they weren't. They just wanted to be left alone to do their own thing. And so they were terribly, terribly persecuted. But they really are, in the context of both Vietnamese history and now in the United States as well, they really are on their uppers.
Well, I think there's a very simple solution to all of this. When they apply, they simply claim they're Cherokee. It works for others.
They can become transracial. It's as simple as that. Yes. Yes.
I'm afraid.
All right.
Yes, I'm afraid my brother did when that came out about Elizabeth Warren. He said, "I'm darker than Elizabeth Warren in this." That was very funny. I'm afraid.
Amazing. All right, I'm gonna bring us on to do the super chats now. So, Jaws the Great and Powerful says, "I suggested a Britisher Helen Dale crossover to them over a year ago under a throwaway Twitter account. I await my cut of the super chats. You're welcome." Sitskoen says, 77 seconds late. Super chat effed me. Thanks for that, Sitskoen. Sitskoen is our resident timekeeper. Every single, pretty much.
I'm still quite sure we actually started exactly at past.
We might have, but there is a slight stream delay to YouTube, so I'm sure he's moaning about that. But he basically is our resident timekeeper. He lets us know to the second how late we are, which includes, so occasionally we miss a week because of illness or something like that, and so he will calculate how many seconds are in the week that we've missed up until the point where we are, and usually with an amusing analogy alongside. Always good. Thank you to Mingus Dew for becoming a member. Always very appreciated. Tailed Feature says, "Looking forward to the Helen Britisher Romanoff." We were talking about this briefly before the stream began and saying perhaps that wouldn't happen this evening, but just for the purposes of this super chat, who is your favourite leader of Rome, Britisher and Helen? Britisher first, go on.
It's got to be Vespasian, Emperor Vespasian, who I just think some of the anecdotes you hear about the guy, he seemed to have had a real sense of humour. He seems to have been rather sarcastic. And you know, what you can say about many of the tyrants out there, you know, in their history, is that they really just were as tyrants are, humorless bastards. Whereas that chap, you could sense that you could actually have a laugh with him.
So there's the Britisher's choice. And Helen, any choice?
Well, inevitably with me, because I've got legal training. And in order to practice up in Scotland, because it's a mixed, Scotland has a different legal system, so you have to do a year long in order to be able to. I went up to Scotland as a qualified English solicitor, but I couldn't practice in Scottish law without being supervised by a Scottish solicitor. I was only allowed to do English work until I had done a year-long subject in Roman law. So in order to, and because there are areas where Scots law, property law is completely different, for example, and I do remember spending about 3 weeks thinking that I was never going to understand Roman property law. I was just going, okay, I'm a common lawyer, this isn't working, I'm going to have to leave Edinburgh and go back down to London because my brain is going to melt. And then one day I woke up in the morning and I just had that thing where it clicked. For me. It just, all the pieces fell into place and I understood it. And I can now sort of visualize the two systems next to each other. But my most admired Roman lawyer is a chap called Gaius. Well, we don't know if Gaius is actually a chap. And that's the Institution of Gaius there. And when you get this from the Avizandum, which is a legal bookshop up in Edinburgh, you will see that it's a parallel text with Latin down one page and English down the other. And it is a model of beautiful, clear legal exposition. And extraordinarily revealing of their society and the way their society worked. Gaius, we're not quite sure when he or she lived. We think that he or she started as a legal practitioner and then became an academic. But this isn't.
Oh no,
we don't know. But based on a lifetime of experience, clearly as a legal practitioner, what you've got in this book is not only legal arguments and guidance and principles of law like you would get in any modern legal textbook. You've also got model contracts and, contracts of sale, contracts of hire, commercial loans, non-commercial loans, loans for use, I mean, comodatum, and all of this. And they're all through the book, and it's so beautifully written and so clear. And the thing is, okay, I can read Latin, but even for someone who can't read Latin and you're just going through the English, if you're a lawyer, you can pick up the Institutes of Gaius and you will instantly recognize your profession. And you will think, my goodness, lawyers.
They've existed since time immemorial.
You surprised me there, because the way you built it up when you said, "Oh, lawyer," I sort of thought it's going to go Cicero here.
No, well, I mean, Cicero was Cicero was a wonderful writer and orator, but there are times, for example, where you can read some of Cicero's legal arguments where he actually makes errors, because he started out in life as more of a writer and philosopher, but because he didn't come from the right sort of background, until he met the woman who would become his wife, Terentia, had a lot more money than him, he had to find a job, basically, because he just didn't have that much money. And he was only able to sort of build up his money and career and so on and so forth by being a legal practitioner, but he didn't really want to do that. He wanted to be a big fellow, and that's how he finished up being consul, and that's why he wrote all this ridiculous stuff about how wonderful Rome was when I was consul, and the thing is, and despite knowing better, like completely abrogating the rule of law with the Catilinarian conspiracy and executing people without due process and all of these things that he knew better. He absolutely knew better, but it was that original instinct to make a big fellow of himself and to be the top dog overwhelmed the devotion to the idea of the rule of law and equal justice under law and all of these sort of basic legal principles. But I mean, it just sort of, it reminded me, encountering Gaius for the first time was very much the first lawyer joke you hear, and I'm going to tell the Roman version of it, is, what do you call 20 lawyers chained together at the bottom of the Tiber? A good start. Some things absolutely never change.
They transcend time. Marvelous.
They transcend time. So Gaius for me, Gaius is my favourite.
Gaius and Vespasian. So neither.
Do we really think that Gaius, in that regard, was a real person, or do we think that he's possibly an amalgam of people?
This has been argued by scholars, but the thing is, the style, the writing style, is very consistent. Like, when you had people dividing Homer up into lots of, oh no, there's not one Homer, there's 7. I mean, they've retreated from that position now, but it does seem that the Iliad and the Odyssey are the work of 2 different hands. The style is really quite different, whereas the style of Gaius's Institutes very consistent.
Well, you see, that the reason I had that thought was because, of course, Gaius is also a kind of Roman name for every man.
Yes, well,
where I be Gaius, there you be Gaia. Yeah. That it's basically sort of seen as Joe Blogg's Gaius.
Well, yes, it's their equivalent of Tommy or Ivan, or that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yes, very much Ivan. Ivan is really the name to bring up in this particular context.
People stop it. People think that Marcus and Marcia, or Marcia in modern expression, but the Romans would have called a girl with that name Marcia. Those were the most common Roman kids' names, and they were indeed very common. There are lots and lots of tombstones with both those names on. But the generic Roman kid, for a boy was Gaius and for a girl was Gaia. That was their generic name. That if you wanted to talk about Gaia in the street or Gaius in the street, if you were talking about, Joe and Josephine Average, that kind of thing. That was how, and you literally will see that in Roman contracts. They will use Gaius and Gaia indiscriminately, and it's purely meant to be a placeholder for anybody
just someone,
else, basically.
yes.
Yeah, someone.
But every man, yeah.
Yeah.
That's why I just, that's why I came up with the question, because,
So it could be
Institutes of
entirely-
Gaius, I thought, oh, well, could that actually just stand for, the Institutes of every man?
The chat is
Also-
saying. The chat is saying no one's choosing Emperor Palpatine. This is clearly a problem. And also
Shield.
another kind
if
of
I just may, because
Star Wars.
I never gave you an example of anything or whatever, but there was when it came for Vespasian, the state treasury was in an absolute mess after
This is
Nero.
a glorious story.
So he had to come up with all sorts of taxes. He had to kind of invent in order to get some money into the treasury to get things going. And he came up with a tax.
Spend a penny. He's the reason
Precisely.
why you have to pay money at a railway station to go to the
So there were basically taxes on public latrines.
Yes,
the
I
folks
remember
that
that,
ran the public latrines had to pay a tax. And
that
Titus...
that whole cultural tradition of going into the loo that you see in Greece and Turkey, it's kind of evaporating now, but it used to exist a lot, where you gave money to, if you were a man, to the bloke outside the men's, and if you were a lady, you gave it to the lady outside the man. You had to give us some money and go in because they kept it clean. That is what they were like. There was a person there who actually looked after them.
So basically, Titus, the heir in waiting, the man who would succeed Vespasian, kind of was outraged at, oh my God, you can't, you're the emperor, you can't lower yourself to be asking for money for people peeing, for heaven's sake. And Vespasian then just basically called, bring me some of the cash that we've collected from this. So they brought it in. They brought in a sort of a chest with coins in or whatever, and he reached down into the coins, picked up a handful, held it up to Titus's nose, and went, "It doesn't smell.
Non olet. The money's clean."
It's wonderful. Just Vespasian in that regard, to me, he is sort of what the ultimate character among the emperors. The one guy who actually falls asleep during a Neronian recital.
And got in lots of trouble for it too.
Yes, indeed.
I
because
sense
he was
that
snoring and everyone else.
I sense a potential stream with the Britisher and Helen talking about the Romans and future.
I believe this is what the person with giving the super chat actually was seeking to provoke.
Oh, I have no doubt they certainly got their money's worth. But unfortunately, I must hurry us on because now there are two of you, and that could go on for a very long time. Right, so Red Hammerhead says, hello all, sorry, off topic, but should we be worried about the academic agent? Locked Twitter account, no YouTube streams or uploads on schedule. Yes, so this is, the academic agent is a colleague of ours, Helen. He came on last week's stream. Unfortunately, I've had to unlist that stream. You will be able to access it if you are a member of this channel, but he's going through some harassment issues and someone trying to dox him at his work, which is why he's gone into. This is the third time this has happened in 2 years.
This is no doubt going to be a rabid right winger seeking to do that, right?
I have no, it's certainly not. But
is he a teacher or a university academic somewhere?
Yeah, he's an academic. So he's having issues, and I've had to copy strike people who've been stealing clips of my stream with him to do stuff. So unfortunately, that's not available. But other than that, he's in good spirits. He's taking legal advice and whatnot, and I'm sure he'll come out of it just fine.
Yeah.
So Scowen says, replace the PD with criminals. That's the answer. Thank you, Scowen. Matthew says, so after condemning the citizens' arrest against Ahmoud Arbery, their solution is to introduce citizens policing. What could possibly go wrong? It's an interesting bit of hypocrisy there. Aaron Telford says, real-life OCP company making real-life Robocops? ? Not entirely sure what that's in reference to, but thank you for
Robocop, Omni Consumer Products.
Yeah. Well, I know what RoboCop is. It's the reference to the conversation we were having at the time. I'm sorry that we missed it then. Coney currently says, have you seen George Floyd's toxicology report? I saw something which said that he was on fentanyl, which is a painkiller at the time of his death.
Fentanyl and methamphetamine, and I think there was also some.
But methamphetamine, it was that he had taken it at some point prior, which it remains in your system.
He also tested positive for coronavirus, and he was an older, overweight black male, high risk group.
Yes. So there's that side of things, but I don't think there's much more to say on that, because the trouble is the autopsies are so conflicting in general.
Yeah.
And there needs to be without an actual medical understanding of a lot of the stuff which is going on there, I need someone a bit more professional to pass that before I could pass judgment.
Well, I mean, I would sort of say that, even if someone is on fentanyl and methamphetamine and they get arrested, they still shouldn't end up dead. I mean,
yes, I know.
Oh no, yeah. I mean, it's
no one is arguing.
It's bad for George Floyd's family. I mean, obviously he's dead now and he can't see this, but it's bad for his family, because everybody from President Trump down was united on this. That this and now we've found out that this police officer's got a record as long as your arm.
Yes.
Everyone was united on this. You cannot have police doing this. This is appalling behaviour.
No one has ever made the argument that George Floyd should not be George Floyd should be dead at this point. Yeah. Yes,
but it's the way. I mean, there was I think it once again was Douglas Murray, but it might have been someone else, so I might be misattributing this. Where he said Black Lives Matter, and more particularly Antifa, need to learn to accept yes for an answer.
Well put. Yes.
Yeah, because everybody agreed at the beginning with, "Oh my giddy aunt America, you need to do something about your bloody police. This is appalling."
Yeah.
Can I just ask your legal opinion on them upgrading the charge from murder 3 to murder 2?
I'm not really across the way. Yeah. This is what I'm talking about. There are aspects of the American legal system that I find completely baffling. But my understanding is that they're trying to bring out more intentionality. Because in our system, the difference between murder and manslaughter in England and murder and culpable homicide in Scotland is the presence or absence of intent. So the classic one to teach manslaughter is two lads outside the pub having a square go and having a punch up, and one of them goes over and hits his head on the curb and splits his head open. And this is very common. I dealt with a number of cases like this when I was in practice, and dies. Now, it's abundantly clear that the other person didn't intend to kill them, but they're still up on a manslaughter charge. It's still a homicide. Now, it seems the American system draws finer distinctions between the qualities of intent, because you have in our system, you can have intentional or recklessness as to whether the other person lived or died, and that can elevate it to being a murder charge. It seems in America, they divide it into intent and then into recklessness and then into accident. But I really, if there are any Americans watching this, particularly American lawyers, I guarantee you I've almost completely fouled that up, because I am not an American lawyer. I understand my system that I've been trained in, and I do find aspects of the American system completely baffling.
Okay,
all right.
Thank you.
Good stuff. The English Loyalist says Black Lives Matter believes they are the only oppressed ethnicity, which is sad. We American Indians suffered and were nearly wiped out. The difference between us is that we stood and fought while Africans knelt and still do. Not sure how I feel about that particular statement. But
it is. I will say one thing. When people talk about cultural imperialism or white supremacy in the sense of turning up and moulding the people who are already there like clay, most of the time that argument's nonsense. Can't be applied to Britain. Can't be applied to any of the colonial powers. It's hooey. But it can be. The people who can make that claim and make it stick are people like the First Nations people in Canada and the United States, First Nations people in Australia, the Australian Aborigines, to a lesser extent, and the only reason it's a lesser extent was because they were such competent warriors, people like the Zulu in South Africa and the Maori in New Zealand. But the only reason it's a lesser extent there is because they won as much as they lost. And by doing that, they got an enormous amount of respect from the people who conquered them, and they finished up being treated a lot better. And you get that in some of the Native American groups, where you've got some of them, like the Apache and the Navajo and the Cherokee, are up on pedestals because basically the first time Whitey encountered them, he got backside handed to him. And others that gave up got less of the respect. I mean, like, the Iroquois had a confederation, the Six Nations of the Iroquois, and this kind of thing. These were quite sophisticated civilizations with very clear and sophisticated ideas of governance, and they knew what they were doing. And so when people came along and took that from them, they have a point. And when other people try to take that point and apply it to the world, it's like it's the same problem as applying American race relations to British history, when you've got our Royal Navy trying to bring the slave trade to an end and the Americans trying to protect their peculiar institution. It's just completely different history.
Right.
So yes, the Native Americans do have a point about the way they were overwhelmed, I think, is probably fair to say. Yeah.
1 second, because my donation history has just caused an issue. But there we go. Right. So toxicology, right. Makuta Pterodax says, this past fortnight has made me a Hoppian ANCAP. Thank you. Without any other qualifiers, that's just an interesting position to have taken. Thank you. Jay says, Helen, should we offer GB status to all Hong Kongers?
I'm very, very close to that position. I'm not quite sure where I am, but it needs, whether I'm completely there yet. They certainly need the gates to just be open to them. And a way needs to be found to make sure it's just not the people who are eligible for BNOs, because that tends to exclude a lot of the young protesters who are the ones who are now the most vulnerable. What you've got with Hong Kong Chinese is what you had in Eastern Europe with Jews, and in the Soviet Union with kulaks, Ukrainian kulaks. They would become what is known as a model minority. And the reason I'm slightly reluctant about this is that Australia has learnt to cope with its model minorities and prevent the racism of envy, which is what we saw directed at Jews in the Labour Party, from ever getting anywhere in Australian politics. It has been completely crushed. After the Tiananmen Square massacre, the Australian Prime Minister at the time, Bob Hawke, at that time in Australia, the cream of the Chinese Communist Party elite, their children, were all studying in Australian universities. It was before they'd started to go to the Ivy League or to the Russell Group. They were all in the Group of 8 in Australia. And of course, they got to find out the truth about what happened in Tiananmen while people in China didn't know what was going on. And of course, every single one of them suddenly then wanted to stay in Australia. And Bob Hawke made a unilateral decision, and this is quite difficult to do in a Westminster system. Trump could do it in America because of the way their system works, but it's quite hard in Australia, and Hawke was allowed to get away with it, where he just stood up and gave every single one of them, and I think it was about 30,000 people, instant refugee status. Australia was hated for it at the time by the Chinese, because we had deliberately just gone in and creamed off their elite. And some of those Chinese have now gone on and done incredible things like winning Orders of Australia and Nobel Prizes for medicine, and and discovering bloody cures for cataracts, and all sorts of amazing things. They've been an incredible minority group in our country. Now, the Labour Party, when it did that, and the coalition, when it did it to the upper middle class and middle class Vietnamese who fled communism, both those parties, when they were in government, put an enormous amount of effort, and particularly the Labour Party, of breaking the left, because this is a problem that comes from the left, it's not a Tory problem, breaking the left of this idea that if someone, even if they're being picked on a bit, not that much because we're still dealing with a liberal democracy, but picked on a bit, they become very successful and make a lot of money, you can't be racist towards them on the basis that they've made more money than you, and because they're a model minority and because they've managed to fit in. And even if they have experienced racism, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't matter. Britain has not addressed that yet. And until Britain does address it, and the most egregious example of it is, of course, the Labour Party and Jews, model minority, excessively successful compared to other immigrants who may have also experienced racism, but the Jew gets the racism and he bounces back up again.
Well, it's
minorities get hit with the racism and that's the end of it.
Well, it's Thomas Sowell, isn't it, who points out that globally there's no correlation between racism and economic success for minority groups. Yeah.
Well, when it comes to...
So I do think that Britain needs... The Human Rights Commission report about Labour will be a start, but the country needs to have a conversation with itself, particularly on the left, to a degree on the right, but only a tiny bit, about the politics of envy. And it has to be made totally and utterly socially unacceptable. Because if we don't do that, the Hong Kongers will come and we will be giving them a poison chalice. And that would be most unfair to people who are effectively being chased out of their country.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I would like to say when it comes to this whole Hong Kong palaver, and that is the government ought to make up its mind, and not just the British government, the Western governments ought to make up their mind what it actually is they want to do with China. Because, I remember the days when, the Cold War was going, and everybody who came from the East was effectively granted asylum by default if they managed to get to the West.
I'm old enough to remember footage of people running over the border from East Berlin to West Berlin.
Because we basically acknowledged that these were hideous regimes and that these were, these were not liberal places. But at the same time, we also acknowledged the fact that they were effectively our opponent, those nations over there. And what we seem to be doing here is, at one moment, we want them to produce the rubber soles for our running sneakers. We want to have trade deals with them, and we want this and that. But at the same time, then, when it comes to Hong Kong, we say, oh, well, yes, but we have to also provide asylum for that population because they're communists. And I just feel this is completely conflicted. If you wish to accept that these people, if they would get out of Hong Kong, would be the equivalent of people who had managed to get out of Eastern Germany or the Soviet Union or whatever, well, then why aren't we treating China the same way we did the Soviet Union back then?
I do think, and this is one, I've spent quite a lot of time on this chat bashing the left, but I'm going to have a good old kick at the right here. Because this is a big thing about which to be wrong, and the wrongness actually didn't start in the Tories. This is where the wrongness actually started with libertarians. Libertarians have to own this one. There was a fashionable theory promoted by some very smart people that if you had a capitalist economy with a free market, you would eventually become a liberal democracy.
Yeah.
And this, and very smart people like Milton Friedman and F.A. Hayek, who are both Nobel laureates, and also Francis Fukuyama, a very eminent historian, have all promoted this, and it is nonsense. And it is a very, very big thing about which to be wrong. Now, the British will know the analogy I'm going to make, but in the process of writing this book and then the sequel, I had to use, for Kingdom of the Wicked, I had to use my classics background and my legal background. It became very clear to me that ancient Rome was market-driven, economically sophisticated, only just missed out on having an industrial revolution in the late Republic. It was like China. It was authoritarian capitalist. And because I did my classics degree first and I became a lawyer later, as soon as I encountered this common libertarian argument that China would one day turn into a liberal democracy, I remember sitting there and thinking, I don't care if you won the Nobel Prize. This is nonsense. Absolute bollocks. And I mean, I remember seeing a presentation by Stephen Davies at the IEA, who was one of the few other people to think that it was nonsense, although he was less vocal about it because he was involved in libertarian think tanks. And if you criticised this position, you would be
one of the yes. But
his comment about the Chinese was, well, you know, they're basically Romans, except slightly less imperial. And so
when it comes to China,
we have to get rid of this idea that you can have a capitalist economy means you have to be a democracy. That might mean some pretty harsh decisions for us, like having to pay a lot more for some things, or completely ripping up industrial infrastructure in China and shifting it to India, and knowing, because India is a democracy, that over time those things will get more and more expensive because India will develop the way democracies develop. It will develop a labour movement. It will develop a Labour Party that has Labour-style policies that will want industrial protection for its workers and decent working hours. It doesn't have that yet, but it will happen.
When it comes to China as well, in particular, because I think China is a fairly unique case in that just culturally they believe themselves to be the world hegemon. They had a real awakening, particularly around the Second World War, when America developed nuclear arms, and I had a good chat with one of the ambassadors from China who came over to give us a talk at one point, and it was as free as they could have been speaking to me, right? And they talked about how, for a start, their entire language is built around this idea of Chinese hegemony. So they don't look at the other world as people to learn from. They look as the learned from, and they look at themselves as this thing. So it's in a case of, if nations have exposure to capitalist democracies that they effectively look up to, or that they want to emulate in some way, then they'll do that. Whereas China interacts with other with Western democracies and other nations, not necessarily in order to learn from them, but in order to take from them what they want for their own ends. It's very centralized thinking, aside from anything else. Yes. Right, I absolutely have to move us on because we're 2.25 hours in.
I'm also getting wind-up signals too. I have to go to bed.
Absolutely.
Some of us have to work in the morning.
We are coming towards the end of things, so I will ratchet through these as fast as reasonably possible. So if we do comment on things, just a couple of sentences here or there, we won't have full-blown discussions. But where's this thing? Rubber says, evening all. Tonight I can correct your movie knowledge mistakes in real time. I think we've barely discussed film. Thank you, Rubber. Silly Sailor says, austerity never happened. We spent 250 billion more a year than we did in 2008. This is why we lose, and we adopt the left's loaded language even when it's bullshit. I would have to generally agree with that statement. If there's anyone who's vehemently against that, you can speak up. But Rubber says, violent demonstrations, history being erased, a weak police, a complicit media, dithering governments. Is it game over for classical liberal capitalism? I don't know, but they will have to weather this storm, and they will certainly have to find a backbone, which they do not currently have.
Well, I would point out that there has, it's not as if we've not had riots in the past. So, it doesn't necessarily always mean that when these things happen that we're entering the end times.
No, but the riots that we are having now have a certain tenor to them, which is quite unusual. I think you'll agree. Okay.
I just thought I would shut up and let you move on.
Fair enough. Yes. Well, another time. British Knight says, unitary government is efficient but corruptible. Trias politica is inefficient but safe. The latter can only work well if people actually care. And that would involve defining what care means as well. A certain amount of cultural homogeneity. But that's another question in and of itself. Thank you for that, British Knight. Red Hammerhead says, it's not that Conservatives don't want the US to be well run. We just won't give massive power to institutions that can be taken and then used by leftist Marxists. I think the problem with that has to be that they create those institutions for themselves if given half the opportunity, and then you find that you have nothing to counter with. But there's that.
I'm also sceptical that the US left were always Marxists. I think that's probably it.
Yes, I agree with Froggy.
Indeed. Yeah.
I agree with Froggy.
Good point, Froggy. Makuta Pterodact says, end automatic student union membership for university students. It will affect it.
VSU, they call it in Australia, VSU.
Yes.
You want voluntary student unionism, and it needs to become part of the next Tory manifesto. Don't worry, I will take that up to Conservative Policy Forum.
It will effectively make atheism to wokeism possible. In effect, it's a campus secularism. Disentangle a particular ideology from that sort of things. Kathleen Batavian, who apparently is me, says, as a reaction to this is an accusation levied against me because I copied one of her very well-written comments on another video. Kathleen says, as a reaction to the Bristol iconoclasm, the Dutch far left suggested to destroy the 17th century Amsterdam canal houses because of colonialism. Worrying whenever everything becomes about short-term excited destruction as opposed to actual symbolic change. I think it's a very a difficult and dangerous path to be on. Yes. Hinch Star says, great stream. Thanks to everyone. Thank you very much. Makuta Pterodact says, Yorkshire Tea has supported Black Lives Matter. What is Britishers and the panel's reaction? In short order, Britain.
Yorkshire Tea has come out. I mean,
can I just jump in first so you
go ahead.
Get some clarity? They've done that in response to Laura Towler. It's a reply to one of her comments.
Okay, what they said?
She's one of the patriotic alternative people.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I don't know. She made some comments saying Yorkshire Tea will never support Black Lives Matter, and then they kind of made a scathing reply to her. Yeah.
So to a certain extent, it was a retort.
Yeah, but
more than likely it came with a handful of sarcasm.
I think they did say
the whole point of the Yorkshire Tea Twitter account, whoever runs it is very funny, whoever that person is. And the whole thing is about the bants. The entire Twitter feed is just bants.
Yes, I remember a tweet by theirs when they informed someone that they were shouting at tea.
Yes.
On Twitter, yes.
So you're shouting at tea.
So, okay. Sitskowen says, you had plenty of time to choose what to do, referring to universities, but you might not have been encouraged by your parents to figure it out ahead of time. My advice, just work. I certainly think that the culture has changed. Now the average age...
I actually think that is sound advice. I think unless you're very, very clever, good enough to get into Russell Group, don't go to university. Get a trade, do something practical and hands-on where you're not going to finish up in debt. And I say that as someone who went to Oxford.
Yes.
Unless you're going to go getting a qualification in STEM, finance, law, economics, I honestly wouldn't study anything else. Don't do a humanities subject. They're a giant waste of time. Don't do psychology, which is a quarter in
I am a psychologist.
Yeah,
but yes.
Don't do any of the others. Do a hard course at a good university with a professional career afterwards. Don't do wank.
There we go. If there's one thing to take away from Helen Dale's appearance on the stream, it's don't do wank, have a wank instead. Thank you very much.
I would agree, given that I'm someone that dropped out of university and then got a fairly solid job working in IT with plenty of opportunity to advance. I don't think you need it. And
anybody who's got a brain in their head listened to Rose's story earlier, who explained the situation she finished up in with this. I mean, and this is very un-British, and I'm going to be terribly rude, but you're thousands of pounds in debt, aren't you?
Pretty much, yeah. I'm not as much debt as I would have been if I was English and went to uni in England, but because I'm Welsh and I went to uni in Wales, I did get a discount on it, but I am still thousands of pounds in debt, yeah.
£60,000.
Treat it as a cautionary tale.
Yeah.
I think I did 1 year and got in before the fees were raised. So I think I came out with about £4,000 worth of debt. So it wasn't a big deal. So I realised after a year that it wasn't for me. But I did think about taking some time before I went, and then didn't. And I should have taken some time, because I think a year stacking shelves in Tesco's would have focused me to either, I don't know, get another job and then get an idea of something that I wanted to do, or so yeah. So if you're not sure and you're 18, 17, 18, you got plenty of time. And you can go in a year or two later, and I don't imagine it would be that bad, and you'll have a slightly older head on your shoulders.
And just to defend my own discipline, thank you for that, Helen. there are two arms of psychology which are uncucked, generally speaking, and those are the ones with the highest requirements of education, which is clinical psychology, which is very much ignoring macro issues and very much geared towards micro things. And the other is, to a certain extent, cognitive psychology, because it is completely detached from everything. It's just more interested in how systems in the brain work. But everything else is pretty much fair game. I give it Stu's corner. That's fine. Just moving, because we're just rushing through the last few things now. My Maven Politics says, my new MP is from this system. The damage is done. Harry Ann Gladive says, if all these lobbies can't argue for toffee but still keep succeeding with their aims, how do we stop them? Also, Britisher, stop calling me Taffy.
Evening, Taffy.
Taffy. We'll have to talk about that another time, if you will, Harry Ann, but we're happy to have you on at some point as well, because it's been a while since we've had a chat. The new IKB says, if we send in the Gurkhas to break the mob, they can't accuse us of racism. Plus, what would the squaddies do to the fool who tried to burn the Union flag on the cenotaph would be a good watch, eh? Yes, definitely. Monty says, Froggy is an indispensable member of the A, B, or C stream. Always down to earth and a true member, not just a friend of the working class. God bless you. There you go, Froggy.
Thank you very much.
Anaquin Cringewalker says, thoughts on Trump rising support among African Americans? He's currently up to 41%. Really curious how the Dems take losing the Black Caucus to Trump. Well, it's very telling that the Democrats' cities are the ones primarily affected by the rioting, etc. So if people in Republican states aren't that affected by that which is going on, they're more concerned still about the coronavirus stuff. I know that general support for the Dems is sliding anyway. And a lot of, all the people who've had their businesses burned and then watched their governors cuck to the movement are going to say, fuck this, I'm moving to the other side, if only because, I can't have my business burned to the ground again. So that's that side of things, I think. Captain Smith,
I will believe it when I see it.
Well, yes, polls. Every poll's a goal. We don't trust polls. Captain Smith says, it's telling that the folks in Bristol couldn't find a target more recent than a man who died 300 years ago. I think that's also certainly a very valid point. Sitzgoan says, the Romans stole my joke on Swedes, referring to you chucking people in the river, Helen. Mr. Jelly Benevolent says, wasn't Gaius just 20-year-old British's pen name? Also, Helen is fantastic.
Well, that would be telling.
Helen is fantastic. Could I get her perspective on the justified strike on Alderaan?
I'm sorry, I don't do popular culture.
Yes, that's a fair answer to that. Not worth responding to that question anyway. Anaquin Cringewalker says, on a scale of oofs to koofs, where do you rank Emperor Elagabalus facial hair? I've completely butchered that. Elagabalus.
Well, you've got a better beard than Elagabalus. I will grant you that much. Not so obvious.
Thank you very much.
Very
patchy in the cheeks, was he? Yes.
And little weird curls.
Yes, indeed.
Hikari Manikaniko says, Obliti privatorum publica curati. I'm not sure what I've just endorsed there, but presumably something to do with public privies. I'm not sure. Yorkie1 says, BBC Radio 4 comedy was creative and funny. Now it's just a woke monologue. Thank you for that, Yorkie1. Drake Glazer says, I await the Roman stream with Mr. Britisher and Miss Dale. If you're happy to do that at some point.
We couldn't possibly. We would break the internet.
Sue D. Nim says, Britisher's recent video was really great. I assume referring to the week that was. Well done, Britisher.
There you go. Thank you very much.
And Patrick says, does Helen think people complaining about immigrants taking their job are racists?
No.
There we go. That's a quick answer to that one. And last but not least, Architect of Fate says, not so obvious tries to defend his chosen by saying it's not all subject, presumably, by saying it's not all cold, and then reveals his chosen field doesn't deal with anything macro. I thought only having micro aspirations led to cucking, reveling a bit too much about yourself, NSO. No, the reason I bring it up is that psychology is a very individualistic discipline. It's completely worthless when dealing with macro stuff. And it's not economics. It can't examine trends on the same scale. It has very small sample sizes, and it's useless at doing it. And explaining broad human behavior, the biggest thing that I've taken from 100 years of psychological research is they have tried to establish meta theory after meta theory, and every time they do it, they balls it up in some way because it's impossible to do. So
whenever I hear Not So Obvious talk about psychology, I always try and work out which one of the two he is. Niles or Fraser Crane?
Thank you, Britisher. And last, of course, Matchstick says, great stream. Thanks for putting this together. Is Helen Dale now the Aussier? Well, time will tell anyway. But thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. We've had a lovely number of guests this evening, a lovely number of viewers this evening, and I hope you've all enjoyed, of course, our rather fantastic guest lineup, including Helen Dale. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much to Rose of Join for coming down, and to Froggy for providing his
Rose of Join.
That's very interesting.
Can I call you Rose of Join? Like, it's late. It's late. Thank you to Rose of Dawn for coming down to join. That's what I was trying to say. Thank you very much to Froggy for coming up to us, obviously from the working classes. And
thank you for inviting me, Mark. It's been good.
And thank you, as always, to the Britisher for your
insight. Honor and
privilege
as ever.
Marvelous. Captain Pangolin saying, what about my super chat? Have I missed one there? If there is, then please do remind me of it. I can't see it just off the top of my head, but just refresh this bloody page. I don't want to miss it if it has come through, obviously. Here we are, super chats. Pangolin. I can't see anything on this page, I'm afraid. We've either done it or it's not come through, I'm afraid. But asked what we can do to help AA. At the moment, there's nothing really that the audience can do, but do send him your support in the comments and on Twitter if you can, and I'll let you know updates as and when. But it's down to him what he wants to share.
Yeah.
So thank you to everyone. Have a fantastic week. We'll see you next time. Good night.
Night.
Toodle pip.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.